Chapter 2187. For example, the northern real swordsmanship just now could not be said to be a pure swordsmanship. Instead, it had given birth to spiritual wisdom and could be called a sword spirit. There were thousands of swordsmanships in the upper sword sect, and there were dozens of swordsmanships that were comparable to the northern real swordsmanship. Since it was the northern real swordsmanship, it was enough to give birth to spiritual wisdom and become a sword spirit in these millions of years. The other core swordsmanships, and even the 12 supreme swordsmanships that surpassed the northern real swordsmanship, would probably also become extremely powerful sword spirits. The Blood Shadow Swordmaster and the others were the best among the immortal generals, but they all died in this passage. Chu Fengmian did not dare to underestimate the danger in this passage. If it was some higher-grade swordsmanship that had given birth to spiritual wisdom in these millions of years, it would probably be much more powerful than the northern real swordsmanship. Let's go. Let's go to the front and have a look. Chu Fengmian's figure flashed, and he took a step forward and walked deeper into the passage. The deeper he went into the passage, the more spacious the surroundings became. At the same time, Chu Fengmian vaguely felt many sword essences. These sword essences were all different, and they came from different swordsmanships. Just as Chu Fengmian stepped into the depths of the passage, several sword lights suddenly came from all directions and slashed towards Chu Fengmian. These sword lights, when Chu Fengmian approached, suddenly launched an attack silently, and a fierce sword chi burst out and slashed towards Chu Fengmian. These swordsmanships were all different, and when they slashed together, it was impossible to guard against them. However, Chu Fengmian had already fought with the sword spirit of the northern real swordsmanship before, so he was already prepared in advance. The ancestral dragon supreme sword flashed repeatedly in Chu Fengmian's hand. It collided with the sword chi that slashed towards him and slashed them into pieces. At the same time, a burst of spiritual power burst out from his body and turned into a protective vigor chi to protect Chu Fengmian's body. Occasionally, a few sword chi slipped through the net and slashed on the protective vigor chi, but they were all shattered. However, these sword chi also cracked the protective vigor chi that condensed on Chu Fengmian's body. In terms of power, my power is definitely not below that of the Blood Shadow Swordmaster and the others. However, it is still difficult for me to block these few rays of sword chi. If it were the Blood Shadow Swordmaster and the others, they would have died under these sword chi. Chu Fengmian couldn't help muttering. Chu Fengmian's Swordmaster. To Chu Fengmian's sword this time, it wasn't just one sword spirit that attacked Chu Fengmian. There were at least 7 or 8 sword spirits that suddenly attacked Chu Fengmian together. You still want to escape? Chu Fengmian's to sword Chu Smaster and Smasters to the sword Smaster to the Smaster via the Smaster. When the golden sword lights saw the war dragon claw slashing towards them, they immediately exploded with countless sword chi and slashed towards the war dragon claw. However, at this moment, crystals appeared on the battle dragon claw that Chu Fengmian had condensed. 129,600 immortal crystals were added to the battle dragon claw. No matter how the sword chi slashed on the battle dragon claw, it couldn't shake it at all. Suppress them all. Chu Fengmian let out a long roar as he channeled all his energy into the battle dragon claw. The battle dragon claw slammed down, sweeping everything in its path. The energy contained within the sword light, as well as the sword spirits, were all crushed into pieces. These rays of golden light all transformed into their original forms. They were all ancient books. Some of them were made of metal, while others were written on animal skin. There were 8 books in total, and all of them fell into Chu Fengmian's hands. The only similarity was that the names of these sword skills were 3 words. Rain Sword Art. The records of these 8 sword arts were different. Chu Fengmian flipped through them. Even the words and sword will weren't written by the same person, but they all had the same name. Rain Sword Art. This seems to be an extremely ancient sword art. It's said that it's one of the oldest sword arts in the world. Chu Fengmian remembered that he had heard of this rain sword art in some ancient books. That's right. The rain sword art is indeed one of the oldest sword arts. It's said that in the Desolation era, A sword cultivator created this sword art by observing the torrential rain. The rain sword art itself has no form. Its form is the torrential rain. In the later generations, there were some sword cultivators who also cultivated the rain sword art. Moreover, they had different comprehensions from the rain sword art and created different rain sword arts. The 8-part rain sword art was the strongest 8-part rain sword art of that era, and it was taken by the Shang sword sect. Xing Xian explained. Although the 8 parts rain sword art isn't part of the 72 core sword arts, it's not any weaker than some of the core sword arts. Chu Fengmian nodded when he heard Xing Xian's words. Judging from the sword spirit, the sword spirit formed by the 8-division rain sword technique was even more powerful than the sword spirit formed by the sword spirit of the True North. The strength of the sword spirit was closely related to the sword art. Only extremely powerful sword arts that were at least at the immortal art level would have the opportunity to give birth to a sword spirit. For some ordinary sword arts, let alone millions of years, even billions of years wouldn't give birth to a sword spirit. Why were there so many powerful sword spirits in the Shang sword sect? Firstly, it was because the place contained a large amount of pure chaotic qi. Secondly, it was because the swordsmanship in the Shang sword sect was extremely powerful. The swordsmanship that could be accepted into the inner sanctum was at least at the immortal art level. After thousands of years, these swordsmanship had given birth to spiritual wisdom and turned into sword spirits. The 8 sword arts are all integrated into the Sword Dao ancient book. Chu Fengmian looked at the 8 sword arts and let out a long roar. Chu Fengmian instantly comprehended the mysteries within and integrated them into the Sword Dao ancient book. When the 8 sword arts were integrated into the Sword Dao ancient book, it turned into 4 pages. It was even more powerful than the North True sword art. Sure enough, it's not just the North True sword art. Even some other sword arts have given birth to a sword spirit. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself after integrating the 8 sword arts into the Sword Dao ancient book. Previously, when Chu Fengmian encountered the Northern True sword technique, he was only guessing. Now, after seeing the 8-part rain sword technique, Chu Fengmian was almost certain that the sword techniques of the Upper Sword sect had given birth to spiritual wisdom and turned into sword spirits. Come, Wonderful Book House. Chapter 2188. 1 inch now that the 8 parts rain sword technique has been integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book, my strength has improved. Feeling the changes of the 8 parts rain sword technique integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book, Chu Fengmian was secretly delighted. This time he came to the ruins of the Upper Sword sect. It could be said that he had gained a lot. The Northern True swordsmanship and the 8 parts rain sword technique had been integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book. Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship had improved by a step. Let's find more swordsmanship. Chu Fengmian's figure flashed again and again, running deeper into the passage. Entering this passage was originally to complete the assessment of the Upper Sword sect, but now for Chu Fengmian, it was a great opportunity. With so many powerful swordsmanship, Chu Fengmian might not be able to find one even after searching for several years outside, but in this passage they were almost everywhere. The deeper Chu Fengmian went into the passage, the more sword spirits he encountered. The sword spirits were killed by Chu Fengmian one by one and turned back into their original swordsmanship. These swordsmanship were all comprehended by Chu Fengmian, and all kinds of mysteries were integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book. After an hour, Chu Fengmian had already arrived at the depths of the passage. Along the way, Chu Fengmian encountered more than 100 sword spirits formed from swordsmanship. Although most of these sword spirits were not as good as the swordsmanship of the Northern True that Chu Fengmian encountered before, the swordsmanship that gave birth to them was at least immortal swordsmanship. Swordsmanship that did not reach the immortal technique level was not qualified to enter the Upper Sword sect. These swordsmanship were all integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book, and Chu Fengmian's strength skyrocketed by a full 30%. Chu Fengmian did not even dare to think about such a speed of improvement in strength outside. What kind of place have I come to? After killing one sword spirit after another, Chu Fengmian was still in shock. He now felt that he had not come to this passageway for a simple test. The number of swordsmanship here was beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. Chu Fengmian would not be surprised if he encountered 1 or 2 sword spirits. After all, the upper sword sect had been destroyed for thousands of years. After these swordsmanship had spiritual wisdom and gave birth to sword spirits, they accidentally entered this passage. However, Chu Fengmian had encountered over 100 sword spirits. This was definitely not a coincidence. Rather than a test, entering the passageway was more like a reward. Not only Chu Fengmian, but any sword cultivator who entered the passageway would benefit greatly. Chu Fengmian was a little suspicious. Why did Jian and I only want him to enter this passage? Among the 12 people present, only Chu Fengmian walked into the left passage. The remaining 11 people all walked into the right passage. Chu Fengmian already felt a little strange. After seeing so many swordsmanship, Chu Fengmian felt that this was not a test at all. From the looks of it, this should be one of the Upper Sword Sect's book collection pavilions. In the Upper Sword Sect, there were 12 book collection pavilions. Right now, you should have been sent to one of them by that person. Xing Xian observed his surroundings and slowly opened his mouth to speak. Looks like this person has the intention to let you obtain the inheritance. He actually sent you to the book collection pavilion. This person has some foresight. Xing Xian, didn't you say that the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance is only a final test? Chu Fengmian could not help but ask when he heard Xing Xian's words. The final inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect is indeed something that only those who have completed the final exam of the Upper Sword Sect are qualified to obtain. However, who said that there's only one type of exam? When Xing Xian heard Chu Fengmian's words, a smile appeared on his face. These 2 passages are actually a type of test. However, it is up to that person to decide who enters which passage. Actually, although you can obtain great benefits after entering the passage, you will also have to face the siege of countless sword spirits. In fact, it is much more dangerous than the other passage. It is more dangerous, but it also contains greater opportunities. The Upper Sword Sect's test has always been a combination of fortune and misfortune. However, for what I can see, this person has the intention of grooming you. That's why he sent you here. If you can leave this place alive, you have at least an 80% chance of obtaining the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. I see. Chu Fengmian nodded inwardly when he heard Xing Xian's words. Indeed, coming to this passageway was indeed an amazing opportunity, but it was also incomparably dangerous. For example, after Chu Fengmian entered the depths of this passageway, he was besieged by more than a dozen sword spirits several times. The weakest of these sword spirits was not much different from an ordinary immortal warrior. The stronger ones were even comparable to experts at the level of Tianxing Jiandi. In terms of danger, it was indeed much more dangerous than the other passage. For example, Immortal Sword Qin, even Kung Su's Heaven Piercer, and the others might not be able to leave alive after entering this passage. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian's strength was enough, so entering this passage was a kind of opportunity for him. If he was not strong enough, entering this passage would be a disaster. Since you have arrived at the book collection pavilion, you can look for the real treasure hidden here. Xing Xian's voice suddenly sounded in Chu Fengmian's mind. In the 12 book collection pavilions of the Upper Sword Sect, there is a supreme sword art in each of them. There are 6 core sword arts and 300 ordinary sword arts. The sword spirits are also in this book collection pavilion. Obviously, they are all trapped here. If you look carefully, you should be able to find the sword spirit of the supreme sword art. The sword spirit of the supreme sword art. Chu Fengmian's eyes suddenly moved when he heard this, revealing a hint of excitement. The 12 supreme sword arts in the Upper Sword Sect were all earth-shattering sword arts. One should know that the Northern True Sword Art was an invincible sword art created by an immortal saint, but could only be ranked among the 72 core sword arts. It was not qualified to be one of the 12 supreme sword arts. These 12 supreme sword arts were at least created by immortal venerables or even immortal emperors who were at the peak of the 9th stage immortal realm. One should know that the 9 profound immortal art that Chu Fengmian obtained was actually created by an immortal venerable expert, the nine profound, immortal, venerable. Chu Fengmian knew how powerful the nine profound immortal art was. The power of these 12 supreme sword arts was definitely not inferior to the nine profound immortal art, or even stronger. End of chapter. Chapter 2189. If Chu Fengmian could really obtain a supreme sword technique, it would be of great benefit to him. It was even possible for his sword principle to take another step forward. But you have to know that the stronger the sword technique, the more powerful the sword spirit will be. If you go and look for him, it's still unknown who will emerge victorious. Xing Xian reminded him, I know, wealth comes from danger. If I can't even subdue a sword technique, how can I become a sword principle supreme? Let's go. Chu Fengmian's figure flashed. He activated the phantom body technique and flew towards a direction of the passage. He had already vaguely sensed where the most powerful sword intent in this passageway came from. Chu Fengmian's figure shuttled back and forth. Bookshelves appeared on both sides of him. He didn't know what kind of divine wood these bookshelves were carved from, but they hadn't decayed for thousands of years. But now, at a glance, there was nothing on the bookshelves. The sword technique manuals that were originally placed on the shelves had already given birth to sword spirits and flew away. Many of these sword spirits were hidden in the depths of the book collection pavilion and cultivated bitterly, hoping that one day they could break the seal and rush out. Human, I didn't expect that after thousands of years, someone would come again. Suddenly, a voice resounded in front of Chu Fengmian. It was actually someone speaking. Chu Fengmian's gaze followed the direction of the voice and saw a figure appear in front of him. It looked like a middle-aged sword cultivator. He held a spirit sword tightly in his hand and looked at Chu Fengmian with a cold expression. There's actually someone in the book collection pavilion. After a short moment of surprise, Chu Fengmian took a closer look at the figure. The figure wasn't a real person. His body was still in an illusory state, including the spiritual sword in his hand. Sword spirit. The figure in front of him was also a sword spirit that was born from the sword technique. However, this sword spirit had already taken a human form and could speak human language. It was no different from a human sword cultivator. Jinmu, there's no need to waste your breath on this guy. Let's just kill him and devour his flesh and blood. Then we'll be able to condense a true fleshly body, and our cultivation speed will be millions of times faster than it is now. And we can leave this place. Before Chu Fengmian could speak, another figure walked out from the side. This figure was also a sword spirit. It was in an illusory state, but it had condensed into a human form. Kill him and eat his flesh and blood. That's right. We've been cultivating for tens of millions of years, but we've barely managed to form a human form. If we want to form a real body, we'll need at least tens of millions of years. Let's just kill him and eat his flesh. Then we'll be able to form a physical body directly, saving us tens of millions of years of cultivation. Since he's here to die, let's eat him. Suddenly, 3 more figures came to Chu Fengmian's side. These figures were all sword spirits in human form. They vaguely surrounded Chu Fengmian, and he was already surrounded by these 5 figures. It seems that these 5 sword spirits should be the sword spirits that were born from the remaining 5 core sword techniques in the library. I didn't expect them to have developed consciousness and want to devour my flesh and blood. Chu Fengmian looked at the figures in front of him and sneered in his heart. He was not flustered at all. Since he dared to come, he had complete confidence. These 5 sword spirits were all sword spirits that were born from the core sword techniques of the upper sword sect. If Chu Fengmian killed them, it would be equivalent to obtaining the 5 core sword techniques, which would be enough for Chu Fengmian's strength to improve further. Chu Fengmian originally wanted to look for them, but he didn't expect them to not be able to hold back and show themselves. Beijun, that trash has already died in your hands. It's a pity that he didn't cultivate with us, but died in your hands. Otherwise, he would be able to condense a physical body by eating you today. Among the 5 figures, the first to speak was the sword spirit called Jinmu. He looked at Chu Fengmian, and there was a hint of fierceness in his eyes. Boy, although I don't know why a puny half-step celestial realm sword cultivator like you can come to the library. Since you've delivered yourself to us, we won't be polite. Your flesh and blood belong to us. Kill. The five sword spirits suddenly attacked together and slashed towards Chu Fengyan. For a moment, the sword light flashed. These five sword spirits had already condensed into human form. They were completely different from the sword spirits that Chu Fengyan had seen before. They were actually able to display their own sword techniques. These sword techniques were created by some invincible celestial saints, and they were incomparably mysterious. These sword spirits were born from these sword techniques and cultivated into human form. Their casual attack was the most mysterious comprehension of these sword techniques. For a moment, the sword light was wanton, blotting out the sky and covering the earth as it rushed towards Chu Fengyan. Chu Fengyan was simply facing five invincible sword cultivators. You puny sword spirits want to devour me? Chu Fengyan sneered. In the face of these sword techniques, there was no fear on his face. The Titanic Gate divine sword was also unsheathed and fell into Chu Fengyan's hand. Chu Fengyan unleashed all his strength in the face of these five sword spirits. Jiuxian. The power of the stars condensed on the sword in Chu Fengyan's hand. The Jiuxian sword technique was unleashed and turned into a sword chi star river. The countless sword techniques that rushed towards Chu Fengyan were all drawn into the sword chi star river. All the sword chi was crushed and turned into nothingness when they were sent into the sword chi star river. Chu Fengyan came to the ruins of Shang sword sect and first absorbed a large amount of chaotic chi and condensed it into a chaotic pill. Then, he killed more than 100 sword spirits and integrated all these sword techniques into the ancient book of sword principle. His current strength was completely different from when he first came to Shang sword sect. Even the joint attack of these five sword spirits was easily resolved by Chu Fengyan's attack. Chu Fengyan took advantage of the victory to pursue the attack after dissolving the attack of the five sword spirits with one move. Shocking sword will burst out and shrouded the sword edge. Suddenly, he pointed his sword at one of the sword spirits and slashed. The target of this sword was the sword spirit called Real Mu. This person was the first to show up, so Chu Fengyan would be the first to kill him. Whoosh! The speed of his sword was so fast that it crossed the space. This sword technique was created by Chu Fengyan based on his comprehension of sword principle and space principle. It was an extremely fast sword technique. End of chapter. Chapter 2190. The speed of this sword was much faster than many of the so-called assassination sword techniques. The sword slashed out in an instant. Zhenmu was caught off guard. In an instant, his body was penetrated by the sword light. Die! Chu Fengyan sneered. The sword in his hand erupted with endless sharpness, and the moment it slashed down. No, I have cultivated for thousands of years and gained sentience. How can I die? The sword spirit called Zhenmu roared. His body was shattered by the sword. His strength dissipated, and he returned to his original appearance, a sword manual made of metal. The words Zhenmu were written on the manual. This was one of the 72 core sword techniques of the High Sword Sect, the True Tomb sword mantra. It was a sword mantra created by an immortal monarch expert, the True Tomb Immortal Monarch. It contained the True Tomb Immortal Monarch's comprehension of the sword Tao. Give it to me. Chu Fengyan's mind moved, and a burst of spiritual energy burst out, turning into an invisible giant hand. Suddenly, it grabbed the Zhenmu sword manual in the palm of his hand. At the same time, a burst of sword intent burst out from Chu Fengyan's body and shrouded the sword manual. Suddenly, the mysteries of sword principles contained in the Zhenmu sword manual were comprehended by Chu Fengyan. All kinds of mysteries were integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book, causing Chu Fengyan's power to rise steadily. Oh no, Zhenmu was killed by this person. He's just a half-step celestial realm kid. How can this kid be so powerful? The other sword spirits trembled with fear when they saw Chu Fengyan slay Zhenmu so easily. Their swordsmanship had experienced the glorious and prosperous era of the Upper Sword Sect. In that era, the number of geniuses in the Upper Sword Sect was innumerable. It could be said that the number of geniuses they had seen was astronomical. However, even they, who had seen countless geniuses, could not imagine that Chu Fengmian's strength had reached such a terrifying level. Zhen Mu, who had condensed into a human form, was killed by Chu Fengmian's sword. Kill. I don't believe that we can't kill a little half-step celestial being. After a brief moment of shock, the remaining 4 sword spirits revealed cold, killing intent in their eyes. They unleashed their full strength and slashed out streaks of sword light toward Chu Fengmian. Besiege me? Chu Fengmian sneered. Suddenly, 4 incomparably huge dragon claws condensed above his head and swept down. The power of the 9 moves of the primogenitor was fully activated as it enveloped the 4 sword spirits. The countless sword lights that were shot out by the 4 sword spirits were shattered and their bodies were forced to retreat. Chu Fengmian wasn't afraid in the slightest, even when he was fighting 1 against 4. He even gained the upper hand as soon as he made his move. Not good. Run. After being repelled in 1 move, the 4 sword spirits also knew that they were absolutely no match for Chu Fengmian. Although these sword spirits were creatures born from swordsmanship, they also knew how to scheme. Knowing that they were no match for him, they all wanted to escape. Their figures all turned into streaks of sword light and fled into the depths of the library. Escape? Don't even think about escaping. Chu Fengmian snorted coldly as he drew out both swords. His figure flickered as he chased after them. Raging flames and hurricanes appeared on the blades of the 2 swords as they slashed out. 3 Suns blazing sword. 4 directions hurricane sword. The 2 major sword moves of the first swordsmanship were slashed out. Rumble. The 2 forces complemented each other and suddenly turned into a sea of fire that shrouded the entire library. Under the influence of the hurricane, the burning sea of fire seemed to be able to burn the entire world. Although the 4 sword spirits escaped quickly, the spreading speed of the sea of fire was even faster than them. In an instant, the 4 sword spirits were engulfed by the sea of fire. Under the flames, their bodies began to shatter bit by bit. Not only the 4 sword spirits, but the spreading of the sea of fire also shrouded the entire library. Some sword spirits that were hiding in the corners were drawn into the sea of fire and burned to ashes. In the sea of fire, the sword spirits were killed 1 by 1 and returned to their original appearance, becoming books of swordsmanship. With a thought, Chu Fengmian controlled his spiritual power to transform into an arm that shuttled through the sea of fire. He grabbed the books of swordsmanship from the sea of fire and brought them to Chu Fengmian. They were then shrouded by Chu Fengmian's sword essence. Without exception, the various mysteries recorded in the books were all integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book by Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian's strength increased crazily. Good. With so many swordsmanship, it's enough to double the power of the ancient swordsmanship book. Chu Fengmian was overjoyed. Without exception, the swordsmanship in the Shang Sword Sect's library was at the immortal technique level. It was extremely difficult to obtain a copy of such swordsmanship outside. But now, Chu Fengmian had absorbed more than 200 swordsmanship in 1 breath. Almost all the swordsmanship in the library had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands. The various mysteries recorded in the swordsmanship were comprehended by Chu Fengmian and integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book, increasing Chu Fengmian's own strength. Chu Fengmian's strength was increasing with every breath. Now, my strength is definitely not inferior to Xian Sangtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and the others. When I integrate the 4 core swordsmanship into the ancient swordsmanship book, my strength can even surpass them and be comparable to the divine Wood Sword Emperor. Chu Fengmian felt the skyrocketing strength and was overjoyed. For Chu Fengmian, his weakest point had always been his own strength. Chu Fengmian's strength was tyrannical because of the various opportunities that Chu Fengmian had. Chu Fengmian's immortal weapon, Chu Fengmian's bloodline, Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship, and so on. However, in terms of pure strength, Chu Fengmian was at most close to Sword Immortal Qin. He was slightly inferior to Xian Sangtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and even brilliant Void Heaven Piercer. Chu Fengmian had to rely on other means to be able to fight with them. But now, after absorbing so many swordsmanship, Chu Fengmian felt that his pure strength was not inferior to Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian's level. Chu Fengmian dared not imagine the speed of the increase in strength if it was outside. This is only one of the 12 libraries in the Shang Sword sect. If I can comprehend all the swordsmanship in the 12 libraries and integrate them into the ancient swordsmanship book, how terrifying will my strength be? In a chapter 2191, Chu Fengmian's strength skyrocketed after he obtained all the swordsmanships in the library. If he could obtain all the swordsmanships in the library and integrate them into the ancient swordsmanship books, it would be possible for him to break through to the celestial being realm. I'll deal with all the sword spirits in this library first. As for the swordsmanships in the other libraries, they'll all be mine in the future as long as I can get the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian's eyes were extremely cold. He looked at the sea of fire not far away. The sword spirits, transformed from the 4 core swordsmanships, were still struggling to resist the power of the sea of fire formed by the 3 suns' flaming sword. However, they were already exhausted. Shrouded in the sea of fire, they had to consume their strength to resist the flames almost every moment. If this continued, they would not be able to resist for long. Fight with him. The 4 sword spirits in the sea of fire also knew this. They looked at each other and seemed to have made a decision. Suddenly, endless sword essence burst out and turned into a shocking sword light. The power of this sword radiance had the power to split open the heavens and earth. The sword radiance burst out. The sea of fire formed by the 3 suns' flaming sword was forcibly cracked open. 4 sword shadows flew out from it. They could no longer maintain their human forms. Instead, they turned into 4 spiritual swords and suddenly slashed at Chu Fengmian. The 4 sword spirits were now going all out. They did not hesitate to spend thousands of years of bitter cultivation to kill Chu Fengmian. Do you think it's useful to go all out? Chu Fengmian looked at the 4 sword lights slashing at him with cold eyes and roared. 6 directions, mysterious water sword. The 2 swords were drawn together, and a greenish-blue color appeared on the edges of the swords. As the swords slashed out, an endless wave fell. The wave that was tens of thousands of feet tall suddenly poured down from the tip of Chu Fengmian's sword. It looked like a wave that was pouring down. However, it wasn't seawater that was pouring down. Instead, it was sword chi. There were millions upon millions of sword chi. When they enveloped together, they simply looked like a real wave. Rumble. The 4 spiritual swords that the 4 sword spirits had transformed into fell into the waves. The spiritual swords that they had transformed into were all crushed by the countless sword chi. The sword spirits were destroyed and turned back into the 4 sword arts of their original bodies. The power of each of the 5 sword moves in the first sword principle would increase by several times. This was the first time Chu Fengmian had fully activated the 6 unity mysterious water sword ever since he had comprehended it. The power that erupted exceeded Chu Fengmian's expectations. However, Chu Fengmian also knew that his strength was no longer the same as before after devouring and comprehending so many swordsmanships. The stronger he was, the stronger the power of his swordsmanships would be. These 4 sword spirits simply could not withstand the power of this sword and were instantly annihilated. However, just as Chu Fengmian was about to retrieve the 4 swordsmanship, a sword light suddenly slashed at Chu Fengmian from behind. This sword light appeared silently. Even Chu Fengmian did not have time to react. This sword was aimed at Chu Fengmian's heart and slashed at him. The moment this sword light appeared, the surrounding space turned into a huge array. It was the power of a sword array. It was condensed into a point and suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian. At the same time, a cold voice was heard. After thousands of years, someone has finally come to the library. I will take your flesh and blood. After I devour your flesh and blood, I will be able to condense my body and seize the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian had just killed the 4 sword spirits, and his strength was at its weakest. Unexpectedly, someone suddenly attacked Chu Fengmian. When Chu Fengmian noticed this sword light, it was only a meter away from Chu Fengmian's head. Chu Fengmian would undoubtedly die in the next moment. However, when the sword light was only 3 inches away from Chu Fengmian's head, it was blocked by an invisible force. Rays of golden light flew out of Chu Fengmian's body. These rays of golden light were the supreme sword chi. 2,815 supreme sword chi suddenly turned into a supreme sword formation and shrouded Chu Fengmian's body. The power of this sword light was completely blocked by the supreme sword formation. Finally, he showed up. Chu Fengmian's gaze followed the direction of the sword light and saw the figure of a young man standing there. The sword light just now had been slashed out by this young man. Chu Fengmian could see that this young man was also a sword spirit. However, compared to the sword spirits of the real tomb, this young man was no different from an ordinary person. His body had been completely condensed. He was only one step away from having real flesh and blood. The supreme sword technique in the library. Chu Fengmian didn't need to guess the identity of this young man. He knew clearly now. Chu Fengmian had heard about it from Xianxing before. In every library of the Upper Sword sect, there was a supreme sword technique. There were 6 core sword techniques and 300 ordinary sword techniques. Chu Fengmian had already killed the sword spirits of these ordinary sword techniques and core sword techniques. The only thing left was the sword spirit born from this supreme sword technique. Core sword techniques, such as the Northern Real Sword technique and the Real Tomb Sword technique, could give birth to incomparably powerful sword spirits. As the only supreme sword technique among them, it was impossible that it hadn't given birth to a sword spirit. This supreme sword technique's sword spirit had been hiding in the library, waiting and observing Chu Fengmian's every move. Taking advantage of the moment when Chu Fengmian's strength was at its weakest after killing the 4 sword spirits, the supreme sword technique's sword spirit suddenly attacked. He directly chose to launch a sneak attack and wanted to kill Chu Fengmian with a sword. Chu Fengmian had long been prepared for his attack. In this library, all the sword techniques that had given birth to sword spirits had the same idea, which was to escape from the library. However, only existences with flesh and blood were qualified to leave the library. If they wanted to condense a flesh and blood body, the best way was to devour Chu Fengmian's flesh and blood body. Chu Fengmian didn't believe that this supreme sword technique's sword spirit would hold back from attacking. Therefore, when he attacked, Chu Fengmian wasn't surprised at all. Instead, the corners of his mouth revealed a slight smile. This supreme sword technique was also something that Chu Fengmian must obtain. If he had been hiding in the depths of a library, it wouldn't have been easy for Chu Fengmian to find him. Now that he took the initiative to attack Chu Fengmian, it was tantamount to directly delivering this supreme sword technique to Chu Fengmian. End of chapter. Chapter 2192. Kill. Chu Fengmian roared, and the 2,815 supreme sword chi turned into a supreme sword formation and slashed at the sword spirit formed by the supreme sword technique. The supreme sword formation now contained 2,815 supreme sword chi. The power it unleashed was 20% or 30% of the power of supreme sword formation at its peak. Countless golden spiritual swords turned into a sword formation, shrouding the sword spirit formed by the supreme sword art. The supreme sword chi condensed together and turned into sword light, slashing down. Chu Fengmian had expected that the sword spirit would choose to attack. He had already made preparations. He had arranged the supreme sword formation in advance and hid it in his body, waiting for the sword spirit to attack. Supreme sword formation. The sword spirit's face revealed a hint of panic when he saw that the supreme sword array had blocked his sword and was even charging towards him to kill him. The supreme sword chi was the supreme sword treasure of the Shang sword sect. He had also seen the horror of the supreme sword formation. The Shang sword sect was known as the #1 sword sect. The supreme sword formation formed by 3,000 supreme sword chis was known as the most powerful killing formation since ancient times. Even though the supreme sword formation was not complete, it was still a great threat to the sword spirit who had yet to condense a physical body. Yin-yang reversal, 3 suns breaking the sky. The sword spirit let out a long roar. and a huge yin-yang diagram appeared behind him. Suddenly, an incomparably violent power condensed on the spiritual sword in his hand, and he slashed out with a loud bang. The power of this sword represented the strongest power in the world. The pure power of the sword slashed out, and the supreme sword formation that enveloped him trembled and was forced back by the sword after bearing the power of this sword. Yin-yang reversal? This is the most profound move of the Yin-yang sword codex. This is the sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword codex. Chu Fengmian immediately recognized the identity of the sword spirit when he saw the sword. Yin-yang reversal was the most profound move of the Yin-yang sword codex. The Yin-yang sword technique was not rare in later generations. However, all of them originated from the same sword codex. The sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword codex was able to use Yin-yang reversal. His identity was self-evident. So what if you have the Yin-yang sword codex? No matter how powerful your sword technique is, it will still be subdued by me. You're just a little sword spirit. Destroy. Chu Fengmian's figure flickered repeatedly. While controlling the supreme sword formation with his mind, he also attacked. Both swords burst out with endless sword intent. Sky Splitter. As soon as Chu Fengmian attacked, he unleashed his strongest sword move. This was the strongest sword move he had created with the quintessence of ancient swords, Split the Heavens. Although Split the Heavens was only the first move of the 9-region sword principle, it was created by Chu Fengmian himself. The power of this move was the condensation of Chu Fengmian's strongest swordsmanship. Rumble. The moment the heaven-splitting sword slashed down, the surrounding space was shattered into pieces. There were countless ancient seals in the library that were protecting this place. However, they were shattered by the Sky Splitter. The Sky Splitter slashed directly at the sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword. The swords in the sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword flickered continuously. The Yin-yang image behind him flew out and arrived in front of him, forming a huge sword formation. Boom! The Sky Splitter slashed directly on the Yin-yang sword formation. The explosion of power caused the entire Yin-yang sword formation to tremble. In the next moment, countless cracks appeared on the formation, and it was on the verge of collapse. Break! Chu Fengmian let out a long roar and continued to attack. He even took a step forward and chased after Yi Shiwen. Both of his swords struck out, and in an instant, dozens of sword edges bombarded the Yin-yang sword formation. Boom! Boom! The swords bombarded the Yin-yang sword formation. The Yin-yang sword formation, which was already on the verge of collapse, could no longer withstand the attacks. More cracks appeared on it, and it was on the verge of collapse. However, at this moment, the Yin-yang sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword formation suddenly flashed and broke free from the Yin-yang sword formation. He no longer resisted Chu Fengmian's swords. Instead, he attacked Chu Fengmian with his sword. Triple Yin Slaughter. Boom! The power of the Yin-yang sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword spirit's swords was completely different from the previous one. The previous attack could be considered as pure power. However, this attack presented a strange and sinister attack. The moment the sword was slashed out, no one could see the target of the attack. The strongest point of the Yin-yang sword technique was the transformation of Yin and Yang. One move was fierce, and the other was sinister. It was impossible to guard against. The Yin-yang sword spirit of the Yin-yang sword technique was a sword spirit born from the Yin-yang sword technique. No sword cultivator could comprehend the Yin-yang sword technique. Yin and Yang were reversed in an instant. What a powerful sword! Chu Fengmian couldn't see the attack clearly, but he clearly felt a sense of danger. If the attack hit him, Chu Fengmian would be severely injured, if not killed. Chu Fengmian had heard of the power of the Yin-Yang sword technique. Therefore, when Chu Fengmian discovered the identity of the Yin-Yang sword spirit of the Yin-Yang sword technique, he didn't hesitate to use his full strength to end the battle quickly. However, he didn't expect the Yin-Yang sword spirit of the Yin-Yang sword spirit to be able to escape from Chu Fengmian's fierce attack and counterattack. The invisible sword slashed directly at Chu Fengmian. It represented another peak of the Yin-Yang sword technique. Immortal! Chu Fengmian shouted angrily. 129,600 immortal crystals emerged from his body. Each immortal crystal turned into a formation, eye, and suddenly formed a large formation. Immortal secret technique. This time, the power of the immortal secret technique was more powerful than the one Chu Fengyan had used in Sword City. Chu Fengyan's strength had increased by 3 times. This was because Chu Fengyan had swallowed a large number of chaotic pills. Most of the chaotic chi in the chaotic pills had been swallowed by the immortal crystals in Chu Fengyan's body. The stronger each immortal crystal was, the stronger the power of the immortal secret technique would be when it was condensed and activated. Chu Fengyan's strength had increased by 3 times. The invisible sword was immediately reflected in Chu Fengyan's eyes. The sword in his hand suddenly slashed out and collided with the sword in the air. Chu Fengyan had activated the immortal secret technique. This sword was the peak of Chu Fengyan's strength. Under the collision of the yin-yang sword spirit's sword, the yin-yang sword spirit's sword was shattered. In a chapter 2193. Impossible. You're only a half-step celestial being. How can you be so powerful? Your strength has surpassed an immortal general. Impossible. The yin-yang sword spirit was so shocked that he couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Chu Fengyan neutralize his yin-yang swordsmanship. Although he was a sword spirit, his true strength had surpassed that of an ordinary immortal general and was comparable to a profound heaven immortal marquis. However, he had been defeated by Chu Fengyan. How could he believe this? Die! Chu Fengyan didn't waste time talking nonsense with the yin-yang sword spirit. His figure flickered and arrived in front of the yin-yang sword spirit in a single step. He slashed down with his sword, and the yin-yang sword spirit's body was instantly shredded to pieces. A stream of sword intent flew out of the yin-yang sword spirit's body and gradually condensed in front of Chu Fengyan, turning into a sword scripture. The words yin-yang were written in large font on the scripture. It's really the yin-yang sword scripture. I didn't expect it to be inscribed with sword intent. It hasn't disappeared after millions of years. Instead, the sword intent has condensed into a physical form. Chu Fengyan stared at the yin-yang sword codex in astonishment. The scripture wasn't made of paper, metal, beast skin, or dragon scales. It was inscribed with sword intent. An invincible sword cultivator left behind his sword intent and condensed it into a physical form, turning it into the scripture. Chu Fengyan couldn't even imagine what kind of existence the expert who had left behind the yin-yang sword codex was. The sword intent left behind by some sword cultivators could exist for a long time, even after the death of the sword cultivator. However, it could last for tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years. For example, the sword intent left behind by Chu Fengyan could exist for tens of thousands of years. However, it would also vanish after tens of thousands of years. However, the scripture had existed for at least tens of millions of years. After tens of millions of years, not only did the sword intent in the scripture not vanish, but also became more tangible. Chu Fengyan was amazed. The creator of the yin-yang sword scripture was an invincible immortal emperor, the yin-yang immortal emperor. It's not strange for his sword intent to be immortal for millions of years. The things left behind by each invincible immortal emperor can't be judged by common sense. Compared to Chu Fengyan, Xingxian knew more about the scripture's origins. An immortal emperor. Hearing this, Chu Fengyan felt relieved. Immortal emperors were unattainable existences to the current Chu Fengyan. Chu Fengyan already had some understanding of the existence of immortal emperors when he was in the Buddhist temple of the Pure Land. Demon Emperor Xue had been killed by the First Sword Sovereign for tens of thousands of years, but his heart was still beating, containing incredible power. The power of an immortal emperor was indeed beyond Chu Fengyan's reach. The yin-yang sword scripture is indeed worthy of being created by an immortal emperor. With a thought, the scripture landed in Chu Fengyan's palm. The scripture was condensed from sword intent. Chu Fengyan activated his sword intent and flipped it open. The scripture's contents immediately entered Chu Fengyan's mind. After 5 minutes, Chu Fengmian slowly opened his eyes. The mysteries of the various sword arts recorded in the scripture were far superior to the other sword arts Chu Fengmian had obtained. For example, the northern true sword arts and true tomb sword arts were far inferior to the scripture. Although the immortal Emperor Yin Yang wasn't a sword cultivator, the scripture he created can be considered the pinnacle of immortal arts. It's second only to the 10 great ancient immortal arts. Chu Fengmian sighed with emotion as he read through the scripture and comprehended its mysteries. Given Chu Fengmian's understanding of Sword Dao, he would have been able to comprehend the mysteries of ordinary immortal arts in a few breaths' time and integrate them into the scripture. However, the mysteries of the various sword arts recorded in the scripture were truly beyond Chu Fengmian's expectations. It wouldn't be possible to fully comprehend them in a short time. Luckily, there's no time limit for this test. I'm safe in the library now, and I can fully comprehend the secrets of the Yin Yang Sword Codex. That's why I can study the other sword arts I've obtained. All the sword spirits in the library had been killed by Chu Fengmian. The library was now an incomparably safe place. Protected by restrictions, Chu Fengmian didn't need to worry about a sneak attack from the outside world. It could be said to be the safest place in the world. Chu Fengmian had killed a large number of sword spirits in the library and obtained hundreds of sword arts. Now, Chu Fengmian was preparing to comprehend the mysteries of all these sword arts and integrate them into the scripture before leaving. Since there was no time limit for this test, Chu Fengmian could cultivate for as long as he wanted. Therefore, he was in no hurry to leave. Moreover, there were more difficult tests waiting for Chu Fengmian after this test. Every time his strength improved, Chu Fengmian would be more confident in obtaining the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian sat on the ground as sword intent completely erupted from his body. The outside world wouldn't know what happened in the library, so Chu Fengmian didn't need to hide his strength at all. A shocking sword essence burst out and enveloped the Yin Yang Sword Codex. Chu Fengmian wholeheartedly immersed himself in comprehending the mysteries of the scripture. However, just in case, Chu Fengmian activated the Supreme Sword Qi and transformed it into a Supreme Sword formation to protect Chu Fengmian's body. The Tao of Yin and Yang. Yin-Yang diagram emerged behind Chu Fengmian. The scripture also emerged above his head. Waves of sword intent were integrated into the scripture to familiarize himself with the new chapter. New pages appeared one after another. Each new page contained the Tao of Yin and Yang. They were the various mysteries of the Yin-Yang sword principle. Boom, boom. The sword will on Chu Fengmian's body rose steadily, and new pages appeared one after another on the ancient swordsmanship book. Just the Yin-Yang Sword Codex alone had condensed 20 pages. The Yin-Yang Sword Codex could be said to be the most powerful swordsmanship that Chu Fengmian had integrated into the ancient swordsmanship books. It was also the most powerful move recorded in the ancient swordsmanship books that Chu Fengmian condensed. End of chapter. Chapter 2194. Although Chu Fengmian had incorporated the mysteries of the 9 forms of the primogenitor into the ancient book, he had only comprehended the first 6 forms of the 9 forms of the primogenitor. As for the last 3 moves, Chu Fengmian hadn't comprehended them yet. Naturally, they weren't as powerful as the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. After all, the Yin-Yang Sword Codex had been completely integrated into the ancient Sword Dao book. The integration of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex had increased Chu Fengmian's strength by more than 50%. The integration of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex alone had increased Chu Fengmian's strength by 50%. The power of Yin and Yang circulated within the ancient book. However, Chu Fengmian had yet to fully comprehend the various mysteries of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. After all, this was a sword technique created by a sword emperor. Chu Fengmian could only be considered to have integrated the Yin-Yang Sword Codex into the ancient Sword Dao book. If Zhang Xian wanted to fully utilize it, he would still have to temper himself. However, as Chu Fengmian's mastery of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex increased in the future, Chu Fengmian's strength would be further enhanced. Chu Fengmian wasn't in a hurry after integrating the Yin-Yang Sword Codex into the ancient sword doctrine book. He still sat in the library and grabbed the real tomb sword technique to comprehend it. All the sword spirits in the library had been killed by Chu Fengyan. All the swordsmanship manuals were now in Chu Fengyan's hands. He sat on the ground and studied them one by one, integrating them into the ancient swordsmanship manuals. The sword intent on Chu Fengyan's body rose little by little. At the same time, a brand new page of the ancient sword art book was continuously condensing. Behind Chu Fengyan, the ancient swordsmanship book also became larger and larger. After condensing more and more swordsmanship, the power contained in the ancient swordsmanship book also became stronger and stronger. Now, just this Sword Dao ancient book alone could be considered an extremely powerful immortal artifact. However, the ancient Sword Dao book was the foundation of Chu Fengyan's power. It was the condensation of Chu Fengyan's sword intent. Unless he died, the ancient Sword Dao book would never fall into the hands of others. It's about time. Chu Fengyan, who was sitting on the ground, suddenly opened his eyes. The sword intent on his body gradually withdrew and merged into Chu Fengyan's body. Although Chu Fengyan didn't seem to have changed much, he knew that the power of the ancient swordsmanship book had increased tremendously after incorporating so many sword techniques. Chu Fengyan's strength had almost doubled compared to when he had just entered the library. For Chu Fengyan, the innumerable swordsmanship in the library was a great opportunity. This kind of opportunity was hard to come by even in 10,000 years. It's already been 2 hours. Chu Fengyan stood up and calculated the time. It had been 4 hours since he entered the passage. The others who had entered the passageway to take the test had passed the test in 2 hours of the slowest. Chu Fengyan was much slower. Although there was no time limit for this test, Chu Fengyan didn't want to attract too much attention. He moved his body, turned into a conveyance light, and suddenly flew into the depths of the passageway. Originally, Chu Fengyan could only reveal his identity due to the suppression in the passageway. But now, Chu Fengyan's strength had skyrocketed. Chu Fengyan could resist the suppression in the passageway and fly with the conveyance light. Although the speed was much slower than outside, it was still much faster than walking. Chu Fengyan easily flew over the remaining distance of the passageway. This passageway was a library of the Shang sword sect. The only danger was those sword spirits who had already given birth to consciousness. Now, Chu Fengyan had captured all of these sword spirits. Chu Fengyan didn't encounter any obstacles along the way. Soon, he arrived at the deepest part of the passageway. There was still a transmission formation here. Chu Fengyan stepped into the transmission formation. The next moment, Chu Fengyan's body was brought to a square by a force. Chu Fengyan saw the 6 figures in the square at a glance. Sword Immortal Qin, Kung Su Sky Piercer, Flying Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian, Gu Qianjun, Divine Wood Sword Emperor. The 6 of them had already passed the test. They were already waiting in the square, sitting on the ground, and cultivating. Chu Fengyan looked over and saw that many of them had bloodstains on their bodies. They seemed to have been injured in the previous test. Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian, and Flying Sword Emperor were unharmed. But Sword Immortal Qin was the most seriously injured. However, the sword cultivators who came to compete for the Shang Sword Sex test were already prepared. They had prepared a large number of divine elixir pills to heal their injuries. Sword Immortal Qin swallowed a few divine elixir pills and recovered a lot from his injuries. In addition, Jin and I also came to the square. However, he stood in the air with his eyes closed to recuperate. No one knew what he was thinking. When they saw Chu Fengyan come to the square through the transmission formation, everyone's eyes fell on Chu Fengyan. He actually came out alive. He stayed in there for 4 hours? Did he just run in circles with the monster? I thought he died in there. I didn't expect him to pass. Everyone's attitude towards Chu Fengyan was different. Xian Songtian, Gu Qianjun, and Flying Sword Emperor looked at Chu Fengyan with pity. They wished that Chu Fengyan had died in the passage. As for the others, they all had calm expressions with a slight smile on their faces. Only the Divine Wood Sword Emperor looked at Chu Fengyan with an incomparably deep gaze, as if deep in thought. Chu Fengyan didn't care about their attitudes. He wanted to obtain the Shang Sword Sex inheritance. He had to surpass everyone. Chu Fengyan also came to the square and began to meditate and rest. Chu Fengmian had the divine pulse and didn't need a rest. There was a large amount of chaotic qi in the Shang Sword Sect ruins. Although Chu Fengmian couldn't absorb a large amount of chaotic qi, it was enough for him to recover his strength with the divine pulse. However, in order to not appear too special, Chu Fengmian still sat down to rest. He took out a few divine elixir pills to recover his spiritual power and refine them. Sect Master Chu, what kind of monster did you encounter in there? It actually entangled with you for 4 hours. Just as Chu Fengmian sat down, Kung Su's Sky Piercer beside him asked curiously. When I was inside, I encountered a golden blade tiger. I almost died in its mouth. End of chapter. Chapter 2195. Golden Blade Tiger? Chu Fengmian was a little surprised when he heard the name. He guessed that Chu Fengmian would encounter a different test because he had taken a different path. However, brilliant Void Heaven Piercer encountered a Golden Blade Tiger? Chu Fengmian had only heard of the name Golden Blade Tiger from ancient books. It was said that it was one of the most ancient demonic beasts. It was a demonic beast that existed in the Desolate Era and was the overlord of the Tiger Clan. Any Golden Blade Tiger, after reaching adulthood, would have the strength above the celestial realm. It could be said that it was a genuine immortal beast. The powerful Golden Blade Tiger could even reach the Immortal King realm, Immortal Monarch realm, or even the Heaven realm. The Golden Blade Tiger clan had gone extinct a long time ago. Now, any demonic beasts in the Tiger clan who possessed the bloodline of the Golden Blade Tiger would be considered extraordinary. Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer was able to survive after encountering a Golden Blade Tiger. This meant that he was indeed very powerful. After all, many adult Golden Blade Tigers possess the strength of an immortal general. Moreover, the strength of the Golden Blade Tiger could be said to be invincible in the same realm. Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer was able to kill the Golden Blade Tiger and pass the test without any injuries. Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer's strength was not as simple as it seemed. Looks like we encountered different things. The Flying Sword Emperor encountered a golden dragon. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor encountered a wild python, and Xian Songtian encountered a great vigor demon statue. Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer said when he saw Chu Fengmian's shocked expression. Golden dragon, wild python, great vigor demon statue. Chu Fengmian had seen the names mentioned by the Kung Su Sky Piercer in ancient books before. They were all famous existences. This golden dragon is a mutated species born from the mating of an ancient battle dragon and a type of mutated beast, the yellow-scaled python. Although it does not have a pure dragon bloodline, it is not inferior to a true ancient dragon. It is considered an outstanding existence outside of the 8 great ancient dragon tribes. The wild python had a terrifying origin. It was said that it was a giant python that inherited the bloodline of the soaring serpent. It was extremely powerful and had the power to tear the heavens and earth apart. Its huge body could crush everything. The Vigor Devil statue was a kind of puppet refined by an ancient secret technique. This kind of Vigor Devil statue could only be refined by a devil above the celestial being realm. It could lock the demonic will within its body, causing the Vigor Demon statue to be immensely strong and not afraid of any attacks. Killing the Vigor Demon statue was dozens of times more difficult than killing a martial artist or demon god of the same realm. From the looks of it, although the things that these people encountered varied in strength, they were all famous giant beasts from ancient times. It was no wonder that so many people died in the tunnel. However, Chu Fengmian had also noticed that he was indeed an exception. Everyone present had killed their opponents in the passageway in order to complete the assessment. Only Chu Fengmian entered the library. What did you encounter? He actually stayed inside for 4 hours. While Chu Fengmian was still pondering, Quincy Sky Piercer asked curiously. Such enormous beasts were extremely difficult to deal with. Once they attacked, they would have to unleash their full strength. It would be difficult for them to last for 2 hours. If they couldn't kill the strange beast after 2 hours, they would be in grave danger. Chu Fengmian stayed in the tunnel for 2 hours. Originally, everyone thought that Chu Fengmian was dead for sure. They didn't expect Chu Fengmian to come out, which made Quincy Sky Piercer extremely curious. My luck is pretty good. I encountered a green barbarian divine bull. Although it took me a lot of effort, I still managed to kill him. Chu Fengyan said. He didn't mention that he entered the library and purposely made up a story. Jian and I purposely left Chu Fengyan behind so that he would be the last one to enter. He didn't want others to know about this. Since Jian and I had such considerations, Chu Fengyan naturally wouldn't self-destruct. If other people were to find out that Chu Fengyan had entered the other side of the passageway, it was likely that Chu Fengyan would be targeted in the following assessment. Green Barbarian Divine Bull. No wonder this Green Barbarian Divine Bull is good at defense, but not offense. No wonder you could be in a stalemate with him for so long and finally kill him. Quincy Sky Piercer nodded after hearing Chu Fengyan's words. The Green Barbarian Divine Bull was one of the famous giant beasts in the Desolation era. However, compared to other giant beasts, he was better at defense and not offense. It wasn't impossible for him to last 4 hours under the attack of the Green Barbarian Divine Bull. Let's go. Lucky kid. Green Barbarian Divine Bull. You're lucky. Xian Sangtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and the others heard the conversation between Chu Fengyan and Quincy Sky Piercer clearly. They all snorted coldly. Compared to the great strength demon statue and Barbara Python that they encountered, the Green Barbarian Divine Bull that Chu Fengyan mentioned was considered weak. I don't believe that you'll be so lucky every time. Xian Sangtian stared at Chu Fengyan and didn't hide the hostility in his eyes. I'm afraid you'll die in front of me. Chu Fengyan replied bluntly. Just as Chu Fengyan and Xian Sangtian were facing off against each other, Jian and I, who had been standing in the air, suddenly opened his eyes and looked down before speaking slowly. Hearing Jian's words, everyone's chatter stopped. 7. It's a little more than what I expected. However, this is also because I deliberately lowered the difficulty of the assessment. Otherwise, I'm afraid that none of you will pass. Jian and I swept his gaze across the crowd and said slowly, Follow me. Jian and I said. His figure moved and flew towards the center of the square. Everyone who was resting in the square stood up and followed Jian and I. Chu Fengyan also followed behind, and at the same time, he curiously looked around the square. The floor of the square was made of unknown materials. Chu Fengyan gave a try. Even with his full strength, he could only leave a small mark on the floor. Such a mark was almost negligible. Although Chu Fengyan did not use the spiritual sword and could only exert 20 to 30% of his strength, such strength was enough to easily kill many heavenly human realm martial artists and demon deities. Chu Fengyan's strength had doubled after comprehending countless sword arts in the library and merging them with the ancient books. His strength had already surpassed the immortal general realm and reached the profound heaven realm, the immortal marquis realm. However, his attack was only able to leave a small mark on the plaza. The materials used to construct the plaza were most definitely all extraordinary items. Chapter 2196. What shocked Chu Fengyan even more was that as he followed Jian and I all the way to the center of the square, he saw many cracks on the square. Some of the cracks were caused by the huge force. The biggest crack was more than a meter wide. From the outside, even a martial artist who had just stepped onto the path of cultivation could do it. However, Chu Fengyan had personally experienced the toughness of the square's floor. Even with his bare hands, he could only leave an almost negligible mark. Chu Fengyan couldn't imagine what kind of strength the person who did this was. Immortal king, immortal monarch, or even immortal sage expert. Only an immortal sage expert could do this. This kind of crack wasn't rare in the square. It seemed like this square was used by the Upper Sword sect in an extremely ancient era to allow the disciples of the sect to spar and exchange blows. Every single crack on the square symbolized the powerful cultivator who had once gone to the sword sect, causing everyone to raise their eyebrows. Not only Chu Fengyan, but the others also noticed it. For example, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the Flying Sword Emperor were astonished. Chu Fengyan, Xian Sangtian, and Gu Qianjun were from the 9 regions and had read many ancient books. They had some understanding of the Shang Sword sect and knew how powerful it was. Although they weren't too surprised by the scene, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the Flying Sword Emperor were from the extraterritorial starry sky. At most, they had heard some descriptions of the Shang Sword sect. However, no matter how much they had heard, it wasn't as shocking as seeing it with their own eyes. The Shang Sword sect used to be powerful and intimidated everyone. The Shang Sword sect used to be so powerful. I must get their inheritance. I must get it even if I have to risk my life. Kill. Whoever dares to stop me must die. The only person who can get the inheritance is me. Xian Songtian, the Flying Sword Emperor, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and the others had crazy battle intent in their eyes. The stronger the Shang Sword sect used to be, the more it represented the importance of the Shang Sword sect's inheritance. Whoever got the Shang Sword sect's inheritance would have a meteoric rise. Even if they had to risk their lives, they had to get the inheritance. The crowd followed Jian and I all the way to the center of the square. Suddenly, Jian Ni's figure stopped. The crowd followed closely behind and stopped as well. Everyone had experienced the power of the Shang Sword sect. No one wanted to barge in recklessly and touch any restrictions to prevent themselves from being killed. Even though there were many restrictions in the Shang Sword sect's ruins that had been around for thousands of years, anyone who touched them would be in danger of dying. Rise! Jian Ni's gaze looked towards the center of the square. His palms suddenly moved and a surge of sword intent burst out. This sword will fell into the center of the square. The ground around them was shaking violently, and the mountains were shaking violently. Out of the 12 sword cultivators who had obtained the upper sword execution token illustration, 5 of them had fallen after the first test. No one dared to underestimate the difficulty of this test. Everyone stared at the center of the square, nervously. They saw the sword will fuse into the square. Suddenly, a huge stone pillar flew out from the ground of the square and landed in the center of the square. This is... Chu Fumian looked at the stone pillar. It was about 100 meters tall, and there were 12 layers on it. It was purposely separated, and the boundary between each layer was clearly visible. Heaven's chosen stone. Chu Fumian suddenly thought of the Heaven's chosen stone in the 9 regions ancient duel arena. Chu Fumian had seen the Heaven's chosen stone when he participated in the 9 regions genius battle. Injecting spiritual energy into it would show the martial artist talent. The stone pillar was very similar to the Heaven's chosen stone, which made Chu Fumian think of the Heaven's chosen stone. However, compared to the Heaven's choice stone, the stone pillar in the center of the square was much larger. It was at least 10 times taller, and each level was 10 meters tall. Everyone looked incomparably tiny in front of the stone pillar. This looks like the Heaven's chosen stone. Are they testing our talent? Not only Chu Fumian, but Gu Qianjun and Xian Songtian also felt a sense of familiarity when they saw the stone pillar. Their faces were a little strange, if they were talking about talent. Everyone present was a figure with extraordinary natural talent. Without peerless natural talent and shocking fortuitous encounters, who would be able to attain their current strength? It was a little strange to test one's talent at this time. However, no one spoke. The Shang Sword sect's test was not something that they could question. Although the Shang Sword sect was in ruins, they wouldn't even be able to step through the gate of Sword City if they didn't purposely let them in. The seal on it was enough to block everything. This stone pillar is your second test. Jian and I glanced at the crowd before pointing at the stone pillar and speaking. This stone pillar is called the Sword Testing Stone. It's one of the supreme treasures of our Shang Sword sect. It can be used to test sword Dao and sword intent. You only need to unleash your strongest sword intent and pour it into the stone pillar to test the result. Among the 7 of you, only the top 4 can pass the test and enter the next round. As for the others, they will fail. As for the consequences of failure, there are only 2 outcomes: death or becoming a slave. Becoming a slave of our Shang Sword sect, there is no third outcome. Although Jian Ni's voice was calm, everyone felt a chill in their hearts when they heard it. The Upper Sword sect's test was indeed incomparably cruel. It could be said that if one's strength was sufficient, one could pass the first test. However, no matter what, at least 3 people would fall in the second test. Although there was a second outcome in Jian Ni's words, everyone present knew that it would be better to die than to become a slave. An immortal general was an existence that dominated a star domain. They were invincible overlords in the extraterritorial starry sky. If they were to become a slave, it would be better to just kill themselves. Everyone's expression was incomparably solemn. Everyone felt a kind of enormous pressure. Out of the 7 people present, only 4 of them could pass the test. The others could only die or become slaves. These were the 2 paths. This time around, everyone was an opponent. Only by trampling on everyone could one obtain the final inheritance. Chapter 2197. The inheritance test of the Upper Sword Sect is indeed very cruel. Only one person can obtain the final inheritance. The rest will only end up dead. Chu Fengmian sighed in his heart at the cruelty of the Supreme Sword Sect's examination. Although there was a second option, becoming a slave was no different from death. In fact, it was even more humiliating than death. If this is a test of Sword Dao, this shouldn't be a problem for me. Chu Fengmian looked at the sword testing stone and muttered to himself. In terms of Sword Dao, Chu Fengmian's Sword Dao was close to the Lord of Sword Dao in the past. This was only because Chu Fengmian's strength was insufficient. If Chu Fengmian's strength reached the level of the Lord of Sword Dao, then Chu Fengmian's attainment in Sword Dao would be even higher than the Lord of Sword Dao. Among the 7 people, only 4 could pass this test. Chu Fengmian was confident that he could become one of the 4. Sword Dao test. I have inherited the inheritance of the ancient sword sect. This test won't be a problem for me. Not only Chu Fengmian, but the other sword cultivators also showed a confident smile. They had heard about the cruelty of the Supreme Sword Sect's inheritance test. If they didn't have absolute confidence, they wouldn't have come to compete for the inheritance of the Supreme Sword Sect. Although there were only 4 people who could pass this test and survive to enter the next stage, no one thought that they would be one of the 3 who would fall. Some people even stared at the sword testing stone, wanting to see through the mysteries within. If they could grasp the mysteries within, then passing this test would be easy. Chu Fengmian also took a glance at the sword testing stone. However, he could only see the surface of the stone. As for the mysteries within, they were all in a state of chaos. The mysteries of the sword testing stone weren't something that Chu Fengmian could comprehend. Since the sword testing stone could test Sword Dao, then the person who created this stone was definitely an invincible sword cultivator. It was even possible that he was an immortal emperor or a sword emperor. Sword Dao was the supreme weapon Dao. There was more than one Sword Dao immortal emperor who became an immortal emperor through Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian knew that there were 2 people who became the Lord of Sword Dao and the number 1 Sword Emperor. In the ancient era, there was more than one Sword Dao immortal emperor born in the Supreme Sword Sect. Who among you is willing to come first? Jin and I didn't care about the actions of everyone present. Instead, he glanced at everyone and spoke coldly. I'll go first. When Gu Qianjun heard Jian Ni's words, he took a step forward and walked towards the sword testing stone. From the previous test, everyone understood that regardless of whether it was sooner or later, they would have to undergo this test. Furthermore, those who underwent the test later would not be able to gain the slightest advantage. It didn't matter who came first. Since they had come this far, naturally, no one wanted to retreat. Gu Qianjun came to the center of the square and stood at the foot of the sword testing stone. Inject your sword intent into the sword testing stone. Jian and I looked at Gu Qianjun and said. After saying all that, Jian and I retreated and looked at the crowd from afar. Gu Qianjun looked at the sword testing stone with a determined look on his face. A sword essence burst out from his palm and stuck to the sword testing stone. This sword essence poured into the sword testing stone, and suddenly, the sword testing stone exploded with dazzling light. The sleeping sword testing stone was suddenly awakened by this sword essence. A shocking sword essence burst out and lit up the first layer at the bottom, then the second layer, the third layer, and the fourth layer. In the blink of an eye, the fourth layer of the sword testing stone was completely lit up. Faintly, the fifth layer of the sword testing stone also showed some light. But at this moment, the sword essence that burst out from the sword testing stone suddenly disappeared. The light from the fifth layer of the sword testing stone also slowly dissipated. In the end, it stopped at the fourth layer. Gu Qianjun actually only lit up 4 layers of the sword testing stone with his full strength. Seeing this result, everyone present was stunned. Although Gu Qianjun didn't come from a sword Dao sect, in fact, in a sect like the ancient Moon Valley, there were many sword Dao cultivation techniques and sword arts. However, their main cultivation technique was not sword Dao. Gu Qianjun was able to step into the immortal general realm. There was no doubt about his comprehension of sword Dao. But now, Gu Qianjun actually only lit up 4 layers of the sword testing stone. Such a low number. The sword testing stone had a total of 12 layers. Gu Qianjun only lit up 1/3 of them. This result made everyone extremely shocked. How high did one's sword Dao comprehension have to be in order to light up all the sword testing stone? It was simply unimaginable. How is this possible? With my sword Dao, how can I only light up 4 layers? Gu Qianjun raised his head. Seeing this result, his face was filled with disbelief. Although he didn't expect to be able to light up all 12 layers of the sword testing stone, in his opinion, it shouldn't be a problem to light up 70 to 80% of the sword testing stone. He couldn't accept the result of 4 layers. I didn't use my full strength just now. I want to try again. Gu Qianjun hurriedly raised his head and looked at Jian and I. If you're not convinced, you can try a few more times. Jian and I saw this scene and said calmly, "Thank you, sir." Gu Qianjun hurriedly expressed his gratitude. In the next moment, he looked at the sword testing stone again. From his body, a shocking sword essence erupted. This time, the power that erupted was far stronger than before. The sword essence that erupted from Gu Qianjun's body condensed in the palm of his hand and was finally injected into the sword testing stone. First layer, second layer, third layer, fourth layer. The sword testing stone still lit up the first 4 layers. When it reached the 5th layer, it stopped and finally stopped at the 4th layer. The result was exactly the same. How is this possible? Seeing this result, Gu Qianjun was stunned. He had thought that the first time he had lit up a low number of levels, it was because the power he had unleashed was too weak. But now, in the second test, he had activated his secret technique and unleashed his strongest power, but the result was still the same. He had only lit up the 4th level. It seems that the result of the sword testing stone has nothing to do with the power that erupted. Everyone looked at this scene and muttered to themselves. What Jian and I said before was that the result would appear when a sword essence was injected. It had nothing to do with the power that was activated. Looking at Gu Qianjun's result, everyone understood what he meant. There's still hope for the 4th layer. Go aside and wait. Jian and I looked at Gu Qianjun and said in a cold tone. He had already given Gu Qianjun another chance. If Gu Qianjun still didn't understand the situation, he wouldn't be polite anymore. Chapter 2198. Yes. Hearing the coldness in Jian Ni's voice, Gu Qianjun retreated to the side obediently. In this assessment, no one could go against Jian and I. Not to mention that there were many seals in the Shang Sword Sect ruins that could easily kill Gu Qianjun. The strength that Jian and I displayed was not something that Gu Qianjun could resist. Who's next? Seeing that Gu Qianjun had retreated to the side, Jian and I looked at the crowd and said, "Me." Sword Sage Qin took a step forward and came to the side of the sword test stone. A surge of sword essence condensed in his palm, and he slammed it on the sword test stone. On the sword test stone, sword essence burst forth and the first level started to light up. Next was the second level and the third level. Enlightened Sword Qin's sword will merely stop at the 3rd level before disappearing. Seeing the result, no one was surprised. In terms of strength, Gu Qianjun was above Sword Sage Qin. Sword Sage Qin was considered lucky to be able to come this far. After all, Blood Shadow Sword Master, who was stronger than Sword Sage Qin, had died in the passageway. Sword Sage Qin's face turned pale when he saw the result. However, he could only stand aside. Next, without Jian and I shouting, someone took the initiative and came to the sword test stone to take the assessment. Flying Sword Emperor was the 3rd to take the assessment. He condensed his sword essence and injected it into the sword test stone. Suddenly, 5 levels of the sword test stone were lit up. This number surpassed Sword Sage Qin and Gu Qianjun. This result made Gu Qianjun and Sword Enlightened Qin even more embarrassed, especially Sword Enlightened Qin. If there was anyone who surpassed him, he would definitely be eliminated this time. Once one was eliminated, one could only die or become a slave. These were the 2 paths. The next person was Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer. He came to the sword test stone and injected his sword essence into it. Suddenly, the 4th level of the sword test stone was lit up. Even the 5th level of the sword test stone was shining brightly. Just as the 5th level was about to be lit up, Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer's sword essence suddenly disappeared. His results stopped at the 4th level, the same as Gu Qianjun. Seeing this, Gu Qianjun let out a sigh of relief. If Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer surpassed him, he would be in great danger. Now that their results were the same, there was still a chance. Only Immortal Sword Qin's face had already turned pale. He clearly knew that he had failed the trial. Only Chu Fengmian, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and Xian Songtian were left. Putting aside Chu Fengmian, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was a famous expert. His strength was unfathomable, and from his performance in the previous rounds, it could be seen how powerful the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor would definitely surpass him. As for Xian Songtian, he came from the top sword sect of the 9 regions, the Tianjin sect. There was no need to doubt his sword Dao. As for Chu Fengmian, even if his grades weren't as good as his, it wouldn't change anything. Brother Shenmu, you first or I first? Xian Songtian looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and asked after the Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer test was completed. He completely ignored Chu Fengmian, who was beside him. I'll go first. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not decline and directly took a step forward. He arrived in front of the sword testing stone and placed his hand on the sword testing stone. Immediately, a shocking sword intent erupted from the sword testing stone. The strength of the sword intent far surpassed any of the previous sword intents. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the sword testing stone. Starting from the 1st level, the dazzling light kept rising. The 1st level, the 2nd level, the 3rd level, the 4th level, the 5th level, among the 4 of them, the best result was the Flying Sword Emperor's 5th level. However, the light soon lit up the 5th level. It wasn't over yet. The light rushed to an even higher level and soon reached the 6th level. The 6th level, seeing the 6th level lit up, everyone was extremely shocked. Everyone knew how difficult the sword testing stone was, but the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had lit up the 6th level in an instant. Moreover, the sword intent did not disappear. Instead, it continued to rush to an even higher level. The 7th level? Oh my God! Seeing that the 7th level of the sword testing stone was lit up, many people's eyes were filled with envy and jealousy. To be able to light up the 7th level of the sword testing stone was enough to prove how powerful the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was. The stronger the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was, the greater the chance he had to obtain the final inheritance. On the sword testing stone, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's sword intent rushed up after lighting up the 7th level. Even the 8th level started to be lit up a little. However, charging to the 7th level was almost the limit of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. The 8th level was only lit up a little, and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's sword intent disappeared. The result stopped at the 7th level. The result was already extremely shocking. It surpassed the Flying Sword Emperor, who was previously ranked first by 2 levels. The 7th level? The Divine Wood Sword Emperor also raised his head and took a look at the result. He couldn't help but mutter to himself. It was unknown if he was satisfied or dissatisfied with the result. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had already lit up the 7th level of the sword testing stone. It was already certain that he would pass the test this time. Not bad. Jin and I, who was standing in the air and looking at everyone from afar, looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and said. His eyes revealed a satisfied expression. The feeling that Jian and I gave off previously had always been extremely cold. However, he praised the Divine Wood Sword Emperor at that moment. This made everyone's heart turn cold, especially the Flying Sword Emperor and the others. They looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor as though they were facing a great enemy. If the Divine Wood Sword Emperor really obtained the final inheritance, all of their efforts would be in vain. Kid, I'll let you go first. Xian Songtian looked at Chu Fengmian and said coldly. Xian Songtian wasn't as courteous to Chu Fengmian as he was to the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. Everyone in the 9 regions knew about the grudge between the Sword Dao sect and the Tianjin sect. Moreover, more than 1 or 2 Sword Dao sect disciples had died in Chu Fengmian's hands. At that moment, Xian Songtian didn't need to conceal his hostility anymore. Let me go first. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but reveal a smile when he heard Xian Songtian's words. If I go first, I'm afraid it will shatter the pride in your heart. It's better for you to go first. Shatter the pride in my heart. Xian Songtian's face revealed a cold expression when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He snorted coldly. Xian Songtian was a rare genius in the Tianjin sect. He wasn't the sect master, but he made an exception to cultivate the celestial sword technique. He even made the Tianjin sect pay a huge price to obtain an upper sword execution chart. This was how highly the Tianjin sect valued him. Chapter 2199. In the Tianjin sect, no one was Xian Songtian's match in terms of sword principle comprehension. Even the old antiques in the Tianjin sect were not as good as him. This was Xian Songtian's pride, his pride. That was why Xian Songtian let the others go first. He wanted to be the last one to amaze the world. However, Chu Fengmian's words had guessed his thoughts, and he was even despised by Chu Fengmian. Xian Songtian's face darkened as he stared at Chu Fengmian with murderous intent in his eyes. The murderous intent in his heart was displayed without any concealment. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian. All right, I'll let you live a little longer. You're just struggling at death's door. I'd like to see how long you can drag it out. Xian Songtian snorted coldly as he took a step forward and came before the sword test stone. His face instantly calmed down, and he did not seem as angry as he was when he was talking to Chu Fengmian. Everyone nodded at the change in his demeanor. To become a peerless expert, the most important thing was a Dao heart. A Dao heart that would remain calm even if Mount Tai collapsed in front of him. Even if he was angry just now, he would be able to sober up immediately. Kid, don't think that you can be proud just because you inherited the inheritance of the sword principal master. The gap between you and me is huge. The upper sword sect inheritance belongs to me. Xian Songtian sneered as he looked at Chu Fengmian. He was clearly provoking Chu Fengmian. However, the confidence in his words also meant that Xian Songtian was confident that he would obtain the upper sword sect inheritance no matter what. Boom! As he spoke, Xian Songtian's sword essence condensed on his palm. The moment his palm touched the sword test stone, a shocking sword essence shot up into the sky from the sword test stone. The sword essence shot up into the sky and was extremely far away. Everyone was shocked when they felt the power contained within it. The sword essence in the sword test stone was even stronger than the sword essence that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had just unleashed. Even the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's originally calm expression changed slightly. Originally, everyone thought that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was the strongest among all the sword cultivators present. As for Xian Songtian, he seemed to be on par with the Flying Sword Emperor on the surface. However, no one expected Xian Songtian's sword essence to reach such a shocking level. Shocking everyone. Such a deep concealment. The Flying Sword Emperor mumbled to himself. The strength that Xian Songtian had displayed was not weak, but he had not expected that he had hidden such strength. In terms of sword essence alone, Xian Songtian had already surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor in terms of sword principle attainments. Such a fast speed. A cry of surprise pulled everyone back from their thoughts as they hurriedly looked at the sword testing stone. Layers upon layers of the sword testing stone were lit up instantly. In an instant, the first 5 layers of the sword testing stone were all lit up. It had surpassed the Flying Sword Emperor in an instant. Of level. The 8th floor. This sword intent erupted from the sword testing stone and rose steadily, reaching an even higher level. In just a few breaths of time, even the 8th level of the sword testing stone was completely lit up. 8th floor. The 8th floor is lit up. Everyone was shocked when they saw the scene. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor had lit up the 7th floor and had already shocked everyone. But now, Xian Songtian was even stronger than the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. He had lit up the 8th floor and surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. In terms of strength, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor might be stronger. However, Xian Songtian had already surpassed him in terms of sword principle. The gap between each floor of the sword test stone was extremely huge. Such a gap might not be able to be made up with strength. The sword essence has not disappeared. Could it be that Xian Songtian wants to light up the 9th floor? Kungsu Sky Piercer, Gu Qianjun, and the others looked at the sword test stone and exclaimed. After the 8th floor of the sword test stone was completely lit up, Xian Songtian's sword essence did not disappear. Instead, it continued to charge, and the 9th floor of the sword test stone was lit up bit by bit. Although no one had tried the 9th floor of the sword test stone before, they could imagine the difficulty from the previous floors. For example, Sword Sage Qin could be considered as one of the best among the immortal generals. Only the 3rd floor was lit up. Kungsu Sky Piercer and Gu Qianjun were only at the 4th floor. Now that Xian Songtian was about to light up the 9th floor, everyone fell silent. Unparalleled sword principle. These words were used to describe Xian Songtian. On the 9th floor of the sword test stone, Xian Songtian's sword essence was still charging up, try to light up the 9th floor completely. The 9th floor was lit up bit by bit. Half, 80%. More than half of the 9th floor of the sword test stone was lit up. However, everyone could feel that Xian Songtian's sword essence had reached its limit and could dissipate at any time. Xian Songtian's sword essence had also reached its limit. Just as the 9th floor of the sword test stone was lit up, Xian Songtian's sword essence could not take it anymore and dissipated. The sword test stone's light gradually dimmed. 8th floor. It's a pity. Just a little bit more. Everyone sighed when they saw the scene. Xian Songtian was just a step away from lighting up the 9th floor. At the last step, his sword essence was exhausted and he could only stop at the 8th floor. However, the result of the 8th floor was already extremely shocking and he firmly occupied the top spot. One should know that when the Divine Wood Sword Emperor lit up the 7th floor, Jin and I praised him and he was extremely satisfied. Now, Xian Songtian had far surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. Such talent is extremely rare in the ancient era. Very good, very good. Jin and I looked at Xian Songtian and said with a smile. His evaluation was even higher than Xian Songtian's not bad previously. Only the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian can compete for the upper sword sex inheritance. Such a thought appeared in everyone's minds. This test had finally begun in front of everyone. For example, although the Flying Sword Emperor had a chance, it was already extremely difficult. As for Sword Sage Qin and the others, their faces were as pale as ashes. They already knew that the inheritance test had nothing to do with them anymore. 8th floor. Seems like it's still a little bit more. Xian Songtian raised his head and took a look at the result. He then turned his head and looked at Chu Fengyan. His eyes were cold as he said arrogantly, "Kid, didn't you want to crush my pride? I would like to see if you can do it." End of chapter. Chapter 2200. Xian Songtian was full of confidence when he saw that Su Mo had stopped at the 8th level. This was a result that even the Divine Wood Sword Emperor could not surpass. Xian Songtian stared at Chu Fengyan and said coldly, "Even a master of the sword principle died at the hands of the Tianjian sect. You have only inherited a portion of the sword principle sex inheritance. I would like to see if you can crush my pride." Xian Songtian did not hide the sarcasm in his voice as he looked at Chu Fengyan with a superior attitude. Everyone's eyes were now on Chu Fengyan. Among all the people present, only Chu Fengyan had not taken the test. "Kid, don't tell me you're scared." Gu Qianju mocked when he saw that Chu Fengyan had not moved. "Kid, if you don't dare, then kill yourself now. Don't waste any more time." Xian Songtian stared at Chu Fengyan and said sternly, "Oh, it's only the 8th level. Is it worth being so proud of? Chu Fengmian slowly opened his eyes when he heard this. He glanced at Xian Songtian and said with a disdainful smile, "It seems that you're more useless than I thought. Oof, your tongue is nothing. I would like to see if you can surpass me." Xian Songtian sneered. He retreated to the side and left the space in front of the sword test stone empty. "It's only the 8th level." Chu Fengmian looked relaxed. He lifted his foot and slowly walked towards the sword test stone. He looked at the sword test stone and said with a smile, "Look carefully. It's only the 8th level. It's not worth mentioning in front of me." As Chu Fengmian spoke, he placed his hand on the sword test stone and a sword essence flowed through it. Boom! A shocking sword essence burst out from the sword test stone. This shocking aura shot up to the 9 heavens. The entire square and even the entire upper sword sect ruins could feel this shocking sword essence clearly. Chu Fengmian's figure looked extremely majestic and noble above the sword essence. He stood in front of the sword test stone, but he had an aura of supremacy over the sword principle. On the sword testing stone, as Chu Fengmian's sword will poured in, several sword testing stones lit up in an instant. The speed was so fast that people couldn't see it clearly. First floor, second floor, third floor. This strand of sword intent violently charged forward. It was as if the trials of the sword testing stone didn't have any pressure in front of Chu Fengmian's strand of sword intent. 5th level, 6th level, the 7th floor. In the blink of an eye, Chu Fengmian's sword intent had lit up the 8th level of the sword testing stone. All of this happened in an instant. Chu Fengmian had already lit up the 8th level. In terms of results, he was already on equal footing with Xian Songtian. At the sight of this, everyone was dumbfounded. The shock in their hearts was indescribable. Previously, the speed of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian had already shocked them. But now, Chu Fengmian's sword intent had directly reached the 8th level of the sword testing stone. Moreover, everyone could clearly feel that Chu Fengmian's sword intent didn't seem to consume any energy at all. The first 8 levels of the sword testing stone were targets that countless celestial realm and even profound heaven realm sword cultivators would spend their entire lives trying to reach. Many sword Dao experts spent their entire lives, but their sword Dao was unable to light up the 8th level of the sword testing stone. But now, Chu Fengmian had achieved all of this in an instant. Even Chu Fengmian's expression was extremely relaxed, as if doing all of this was a very ordinary thing. Seeing that Chu Fengmian's sword intent had lit up the 8th level of the sword testing stone, Xian Songtian's expression changed drastically. In his heart, he had always been extremely arrogant. In fact, he hadn't even taken Chu Fengmian seriously from the beginning. In his opinion, if Chu Fengmian hadn't inherited the sword principle sect's inheritance, he wouldn't even be qualified to compete with him on the same stage. Even though Chu Fengmian had come to the upper sword sect's ruins, he had never taken Chu Fengmian seriously or treated him as an opponent. But now, the scene in front of him had severely shattered his arrogance. He was now looking forward to seeing the limit of Chu Fengmian's sword intent stop at the 8th level. But in the next moment, his expectations were dashed. After lighting up the 8th level, Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushed to an even higher level. The 9th level of the sword testing stone was instantly lit up. The 9th level. Countless people held their breaths as they watched this scene. No one had expected that Chu Fengmian would actually surpass everyone and reach the 9th level. Among everyone present, Chu Fengmian was the only one who could reach the 9th level. This was a scene that no one had dared to imagine from the beginning. When he saw that Chu Fengmian's sword intent had lit up the 9th level, Xian Songtian's expression was extremely miserable. His hopes had been completely dashed. The moment Chu Fengmian's sword intent lit up the 9th level of the sword testing stone, it had also completely shattered his arrogance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor's gaze was fixed on Chu Fengmian. His gaze seemed to want to see through everything about Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian stood beside the sword testing stone. His expression was extremely relaxed, as he even raised his head to take a look at the result. The 9th level doesn't seem to be low. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. He was so relaxed that it seemed as though lighting up the 9th level of the sword testing stone was an extremely easy task for him. If you can light up more than 10 levels, the upper sword sect will reward you handsomely. At this moment, Jin and I, who had been silent all this while, suddenly descended from the sky and came to Chu Fengyan's side as he spoke slowly. Such a scene shocked the crowd once again. Jin and I could be said to be a man of few words previously. Only when the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian lit up the 7th and 8th levels respectively did he speak. But now, Jin and I suddenly spoke before Chu Fengyan had even finished his assessment. Furthermore, from Jian Ni's words, his expectations for Chu Fengyan were not just limited to the 9th level. Could this person really be able to break through to the 10th level? Impossible, the 10th level? Is this really something that a half-step celestial being realm sword cultivator can break through? Disbelieving gazes fell on Chu Fengyan one after another. If Chu Fengyan was an invincible sword cultivator and an immortal emperor, then naturally no one would doubt that Chu Fengyan could break through to the 10th level. However, Chu Fengyan's cultivation realm was clearly only at the half-step celestial being realm. From the beginning, everyone felt that Chu Fengyan was a little strange. However, no one had ever felt that Chu Fengyan was a true expert and a true opponent for them. However, Chu Fengyan had already lit up the 9th level of the sword testing stone and was not far from the 10th level. End of chapter. Chapter 22:01. Sword Dao Sect. Sword Dao Sect. It seems like we have underestimated him. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor muttered to himself. He had already made his decision on whether Chu Fengyan could break through to the 10th level. Chu Fengyan had already broken through to the 9th level, and he looked so relaxed. The 10th level was no longer a challenge for Chu Fengyan. There's a reward? Why didn't you say so earlier? You wouldn't have wasted so much time if you had said so earlier. Chu Fengyan revealed a smile when he heard Jian Ni's words. He looked at Xian Songtian and said casually, "That's right, Xian Songtian. You're just breaking through to the 8th level, and you're already so proud. Watch carefully. I've already said that you're not worthy to be my opponent." The moment Chu Fengyan spoke casually, a burst of sword intent burst out from his palm and entered the sword testing stone again. Suddenly, the light that had quieted down in the sword testing stone was revealed again. The shocking sword intent rushed up, and the 10th level of the sword testing stone was instantly lit up. The dazzling light stimulated everyone's eyes. The 10th level. He really reached the 10th level. The dazzling light that erupted from the 10th level of the sword testing stone was enough to make everyone aghast. It hasn't stopped yet. What? But at this moment, someone suddenly noticed. Chu Fengyan's sword intent didn't stop after breaking through to the 10th level. It continued to break through to the 11th level. Rumble. From a sword testing stone, a shocking sword intent burst out. It was as if two forces were clashing within it. The shockwaves from the collision of the two forces from the sword testing stone sent chills down everyone's spines. The 10th level wasn't Chu Fengyan's limit. Numerous gazes were fixed on Chu Fengyan. It was only at this moment that the crowd seemed to truly understand Chu Fengyan. Xian Songtian's eyes were wide open when he saw Chu Fengyan light up the 10th level. His mouth was slightly agape, but he couldn't make a single sound. Boom! On the 11th level of the sword test stone, Chu Fengyan's sword intent expanded rapidly and lit up the entire floor. The sword intent of thousands of swordsmanship in the ancient swordsmanship book created by Chu Fengyan burst out. How many sword techniques has this person cultivated? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Seeing Chu Fengyan's sword intent, the Flying Sword Emperor muttered to himself. All the sword cultivators present had been famous for a long time. Many of them were famous in the extraterritorial starry sky. When they saw Chu Fengyan's sword will, they also saw the various sword techniques in it. But now, Chu Fengyan's sword intent contained thousands or even tens of thousands of swordsmanship. How could a single person integrate so many swordsmanship into his own swordsmanship? This was simply an impossible task. It broke the understanding of the sword Dao that all the sword cultivators present had towards the sword Dao. Even the hearts of many people were shaken. The sword Dao that they had always persevered in their hearts was shaken. Boom! 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 Just at this moment, waves of sword intent burst out. The sword intent swept across the heavens and the earth. The entire sky was occupied by the sword intent. The entire square had turned into a world of swords. The sword intent was enough to affect a world. The 10th level. The 11th level of the sword test stone was lit up under everyone's gaze. It burst out with dazzling light that made it hard for people to open their eyes. But now, countless gazes were staring at the dazzling light. They did not dare to shift their gazes away. They were in disbelief. But now, they had confirmed that the 11th level of the sword test stone was lit up by Chu Fengmian. It's the 10th level. How long has it been? How long has it been since there was a successor who could reach the 11th level of the sword test stone? Jianyi's gaze was looking at Chu Fengmian, who lit up the 11th level. His eyes were filled with nostalgia and a little moist. After thousands of years, the Shang Sword sect had changed, and he was the only one alive. He had to choose the successor of the Shang Sword sect, the 10th level. Even in the ancient era, when the Shang Sword sect dominated the world, there were only a few sword cultivator geniuses who could achieve such a result. The 10th level was already extremely outstanding in his eyes. Once he inherited the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect, he would have the hope of revitalizing the Shang Sword sect in the future. As for the 11th level, Jin and I did not dare to imagine it in the current era. But today, Chu Fengmian had actually achieved it. Could it be that this person is going to obtain the inheritance directly? No, we must stop him. Jinyi's expression was seen by everyone, especially the Flying Sword Emperor, Gu Qianjun, and the others. Their eyes were filled with killing intent. Judging from Jinyi's attitude towards Chu Fengmian, the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect would most likely fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. Even if they passed this test, they would not be able to compete with Chu Fengmian in the next test. Kill. Two pairs of eyes exchanged glances, and a wisp of killing intent was gathering. On the other side, Chu Fengmian did not care about it at all. He was fully focused on the sword test stone. He wanted to use the sword test stone to see what level his sword principle had reached. Although the 11th level was shocking enough, it was far from enough for Chu Fengmian. 9 regions. Chu Fengmian chanted in his heart. The strongest sword intent that belonged to Chu Fengmian, the 9-region sword principle, was unleashed. In the sword test stone, Chu Fengmian's sword intent did not stop after lighting up the 11th level. Instead, it rushed to the 12th level. The 10th level is still not the limit. Could it be that he really wants to light up the entire 12th level of the sword test stone? Everyone was speechless when they saw Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushing to the 12th level of the sword test stone. They stared blankly at the scene. Such a result was absolutely impossible for them to achieve in their lifetime. The 12th level of the sword test stone was completely lit up. No one knew what would happen next. The 12th level. Could it be that he can really light up the 12th level? Even Jinyi's eyes were filled with disbelief when he saw Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushing to the 12th level. He valued Chu Fengmian greatly from the beginning. Therefore, he had arranged for Chu Fengmian to enter the book collection pavilion to undergo the test. However, no matter how much he valued Chu Fengmian, he did not think that Chu Fengmian could reach the 12th level. In a chapter. Chapter 2202. No one knew better than Jin and I what the 12th floor of the sword test stone represented. It represented the pinnacle of sword Tao. Among the countless experts of the upper sword sect, there were only a few who could reach the 12th floor of the sword test stone. Almost all of them were unrivaled experts who had reached the pinnacle of the immortal emperor realm. Only sword cultivators who had reached the immortal emperor realm were qualified to light up the 12th floor of the sword test stone. This was an unchanging rule in the ancient era. No one had ever broken it. Even experts at the 8th level of the 9th order immortal realm wouldn't be able to light up the 12th level of the sword test stone. To them, lighting up the 10th level of the sword test stone was their limit. There were countless sword cultivator geniuses in the upper sword sect, but the limit of these sword cultivator geniuses was the 11th floor. No one who hadn't reached the sword emperor realm could light up the 12th floor of the sword test stone. Jin and I thought highly of Chu Fengmian. However, according to his prediction, Chu Fumian could only light up the 10th floor of the sword test stone. Chu Fumian being able to light up the 11th floor was enough to surprise him. As for Chu Fumian being able to light up the 12th floor, he had never thought of it. But now, Chu Fumian's sword intent had already rushed into the 12th floor. The 12th floor of the sword test stone had already shown a kind of chaotic color, and it was extremely blurry. It represented the pinnacle of Sword Dao, the immortal Emperor Sword Dao. Only sword cultivators who had reached the immortal Emperor realm were qualified to light it up. And now, Chu Fumian's sword intent had rushed into the 12th floor. Lighting up the 12th floor, Flying Sword Emperor, Gu Qianjun, and the others looked at Chu Fumian with increasingly intense killing intent. Chu Fumian's comprehension of Sword Dao had reached an incredible level to be able to light up the 12th floor of the sword test stone. At present, Chu Fumian was only a half step into the celestial realm, but in terms of strength, he was not inferior to them at all. Once Chu Fumian stepped into the celestial realm in the future, his strength would reach an incredible level. This was what Flying Sword Emperor Gu Qianjun didn't want to see. If this continued, the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect would most likely fall into Chu Fumian's hands. It was not just the two of them. Even Xian Songtian's eyes were filled with murderous intent as he stared at Chu Fumian. It was as if he could attack and kill Chu Fumian at any moment. For a moment, the atmosphere became incomparably solemn. Chu Fumian, on the other hand, was completely unaware of what was going on. His consciousness had entered the sword testing stone and was trying to break through to the 12th level. Chu Fumian's sword will and his swordsmanship all burst out. This sword testing stone was the best opportunity to test Chu Fumian's current swordsmanship. Chu Fumian didn't hold back at all. As time passed, the sword testing stone on the 12th level lit up bit by bit. Within the chaos, there were traces of dazzling light. Boom! A shocking sword radiance shot up from the sword testing rock. This sword radiance shot up to the 9 heavens and transformed into the shape of a divine sword. It was a divine sword that was tens of thousands of feet long. The divine sword was condensed from Chu Fumian's sword intent. Boom, 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 boom. The 12th level of the sword testing stone was illuminated by the sword intent. The 12th level of the sword testing stone was completely illuminated. This was something that only a sword cultivator immortal emperor could achieve. Now, Chu Fumian had actually done it. Even though he was only a half-step celestial being, he was able to do it. He really did it. Jian and I was extremely shocked. Even with his experience, he couldn't calm down now. Chu Fumian's strength had completely exceeded his imagination. The peak of Sword Dao. How is it possible that he has reached the peak of Sword Dao at such a young age? Could it be that he has reached the final step? Jian's eyes were filled with horror as he stared at Chu Fumian. The moment the 12th level of the sword testing stone was illuminated, the entire sword testing stone burst out with dazzling light. The light that burst out was countless times more dazzling than before. The entire square was shaking. The entire Upper Sword Sect ruins was shaking crazily. What's going on? Everyone present was anxiously observing their surroundings. No one knew where this sudden tremor originated from. However, everyone knew that the sudden change was definitely related to Chu Fumian. After all, there was a sudden change when Chu Fumian illuminated the 12th level of the sword testing stone. Sir Jian and I, what's going on? Xian Songtian turned his head and asked Jian and I. It's none of your business. Be quiet and watch. Jian's face was cold. He didn't even turn his head. His eyes were fixed on Chu Fumian's direction as if he wanted to see everything that was happening. Yes, Jian's tone made Xian Songtian a little angry. However, he didn't dare to provoke Jian and I at this time. He could only suppress his anger and look at Chu Fumian. Soon, everyone understood the reason for the tremor. They saw that on the square, another stone tablet suddenly emerged from the ground. This stone tablet suddenly merged with the sword testing stone. The sword testing stone, which was originally 100 meters tall, suddenly grew even taller. At the top of the stone, there was suddenly another layer. The 13th level. The 12th level of the sword testing stone wasn't the limit. There was a 13th level. The 13th level. How long has it been? How long has it been since someone summoned the 13th level of the sword testing stone? Jin and I looked at the changes on the sword testing stone. His eyes were filled with nostalgia as he muttered to himself. For tens of millions of years, the 13th level of the sword testing stone had never appeared again after the upper sword sect fell from its peak. Today, he couldn't help but tear up when he saw it. The 12th level of the sword testing stone represented the peak of the sword Dao, the immortal Emperor Sword Dao. The 13th level only represented one thing, the origin of the Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian's Sword Dao had surpassed the immortal Emperor Sword Dao in the peak. The origin of the Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian raised his head and looked at the changes on the sword testing stone. He was very clear about what the 13th level of the sword testing stone represented. The origin of the Sword Dao is worthy of my full effort. Chu Fengmian looked at the 13th level of the sword testing stone. With a thought, the sword intent suddenly burst out from the 12th level and rushed towards the 13th level of the sword testing stone. End of chapter. Chapter 2203. Sword Dao origin was the pinnacle of all sword cultivators and the ultimate goal of all sword cultivators. Among all the sword cultivators in the past, not even immortal emperors or sovereigns had reached this step. Today, Chu Fengmian was going to use his Sword Dao to attack the Sword Dao origin. Buzz! Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushed into the 13th level and felt an unprecedented pressure. Chu Fengmian felt extremely relaxed when he tried to break through the 12th level. However, Chu Fengmian felt an immense pressure the moment his sword intent rushed into the 13th level. The pressure made it difficult for Chu Fengmian's sword intent to move. Sword Dao origin is completely different from the pinnacle of Sword Dao. In an instant, Chu Fengmian clearly felt the terror of the Sword Dao origin. It was no wonder that countless immortal emperor sword cultivators in the past had never reached the Sword Dao origin. Even the current Chu Fengmian couldn't compare to the profoundness of the Sword Dao origin. However, even if I can't fully comprehend the Sword Dao origin, I don't believe that I can't light up the 13th level. Chu Fengmian knew that he couldn't fully comprehend the Sword Dao origin, but it wasn't impossible for him to comprehend a part of it. Compared to other sword cultivators and even many immortal emperor sword cultivators, Chu Fengmian had an advantage. It was the incomplete sword technique that he had comprehended from his Sword Dao totem. The content of the incomplete sword technique was related to the Sword Dao origin. Chu Fengmian had comprehended the incomplete sword technique, which allowed his sword technique to improve and surpass his previous life. Now, Chu Fengmian had integrated the various mysteries of the incomplete sword technique into the ancient book of Sword Dao. Explode. Thousands of sword intent burst out from Chu Fengmian's body and fiercely attacked the 13th level of the sword testing stone. Under the unprecedented pressure, Chu Fengmian's sword intent entered and burst out. In the 13th level of the sword testing stone, there was a little light that gradually lit up in the originally deep chaos. What? He can light up the 13th level a little? How is this possible? Jin and I was completely stunned at the sight. The 13th level represented the origin of the Sword Dao. If one wanted to light it up a little, one would have to at least reach the pinnacle of the Sword Dao or even comprehend a little of the Sword Dao's origin. Only then would it be possible to light up the 13th level. This was something that many immortal emperors couldn't do. In history, only the Lord of the Sword Dao, and number one sword emperor, had 1 foot in the origin of the Sword Dao. Only he was able to light up a tiny bit of the 13th level. Now, Chu Fengmian actually had 1 foot in the Sword Dao origin. Jian and I couldn't imagine it at all. However, just as Jian and I was in shock, that flash of light disappeared completely. Under the immense pressure of the 13th layer of the sword testing stone, Chu Fengmian's sword intent was completely crushed and disappeared. The light on the sword testing stone also dimmed. Chu Fengmian's score stopped at the 12th level. Still far from it. Chu Fengmian looked at the result on the sword testing stone and muttered to himself. Chu Fengmian was only able to light up 1/10 of the 13th level before his sword intent was crushed. This also meant that Chu Fengmian was still far from the origin of the Sword Dao. However, Being able to light up the 13th level already proved that Chu Fengmian's Sword Dao had already surpassed the peak. He had 1 foot in the door of the Sword Dao's origin. In the future, Chu Fengmian might have a chance to truly comprehend the Sword Dao's origin. Seeing Chu Fengmian's result, everyone's face was different. The most gloomy one was Gu Qianjun. Gu Qianjun's result was the 4th level of the Sword Testing Stone, which was the same as Kuan Su's Heaven Piercer, ranking 5th. If Chu Fengmian's result was lower than his, he would have a chance to pass the assessment. However, as the result came out, the one who was affected the most was him. He was already eliminated from the assessment. He was unwilling to be eliminated like this. His eyes were filled with killing intent as he looked at Chu Fengmian. Something flew out from the sword testing stone. At this moment, someone suddenly exclaimed. Everyone quickly looked over and saw a crack suddenly opened on the sword testing stone. A ray of light flew out from it. This beam of light was about the height of a human. It was a wooden totem with all sorts of runes engraved on it. These runes were incomparably ancient, and no one could recognize them. However, the light flowing within them resembled streams of sword techniques. Only a sword cultivator with a high cultivation base would be able to see through the mysteries of this pattern. Sword Dao Totem. All the sword cultivators exclaimed when they saw the totem that was as tall as a person. Everyone was an expert in Sword Dao. How could they not recognize this object? It was the treasure of Sword Dao, the Sword Dao Totem. It was said that all the sword techniques in the world originated from the Sword Dao Totem. Obtaining a Sword Dao Totem was enough to establish a sect and become a sword master of a generation. The sword testing stone suddenly opened and a Sword Dao Totem flew out from it. Is this the reward that Jian and I mentioned? A Sword Dao Totem? Suddenly, someone recalled Jian Ni's words to Chu Fengmian. As long as one could reach the 10th level of the sword testing stone, he would be rewarded. Seeing the Sword Dao Totem that flew out from the sword testing stone, everyone recalled the sentence. The faces of Flying Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian, Gu Qianjun, and the others turned even uglier when they saw this scene. Chu Fengmian was actually rewarded with a Sword Dao Totem. This meant that the Shang Sword sect valued Chu Fengmian highly. Even though Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian had passed the assessment and could enter the next round, they did not receive the same treatment as Chu Fengmian. Just as everyone had expected, the sword principal totem flew towards Chu Fengmian the moment it flew out of the sword testing stone and stopped in front of him. Take it. This is the reward for the upper sword sect. Jian and I looked at Chu Fengmian and said slowly, Chu Fengmian nodded. When he saw the Sword Dao Totem, his eyes were filled with shock. Although he knew that the upper sword sect's reward would not be an ordinary item, Chu Fengmian was both surprised and delighted that it was a Sword Dao Totem. Outsiders and almost all sword cultivators only knew about the Sword Dao Totem because of the countless sword techniques recorded in it. Only Chu Fengmian knew that there was a true treasure in the Sword Dao Totem. It was the incomplete sword technique that led to the Sword Dao origin. Chu Fengmian had only obtained a portion of this incomplete sword technique. His current understanding of the Sword Dao had already entered the Sword Dao origin realm. End of chapter. Chapter 2204. If Chu Fengmian could obtain all the sword principal totems and complete the incomplete swordsmanship, he might be able to comprehend the mystery of the sword principal origin. Chu Fengmian had been looking for the sword principal totem carefully, but he had only obtained a few pieces of information. Chu Fengmian did not expect to obtain a sword principal totem in the Shang Sword Sect relic. It was a complete surprise. Chu Fengmian looked at the sword principal totem and was about to take it into the empty ring. Suddenly, numerous figures appeared beside Chu Fengmian and surrounded him in an instant. Numerous sword lights burst out and slashed toward Chu Fengmian. These figures were none other than Gu Qianjun. Gu Qianjun suddenly took action when Chu Fengmian took the sword principal totem. Gu Qianjun also knew that he would die today, so he might as well kill Chu Fengmian directly and take the sword principal totem from Chu Fengmian's hand and then escape. Just now, when Chu Fengmian was undergoing the assessment, Gu Qianjun had been brewing the killing intent in his heart. He had already accumulated the strength, and all the accumulated strength burst out at this moment. Each of these figures looked no different from the real Gu Qianjun. The swords in their hands flashed as they slashed at Chu Fengmian. For a moment, the sky was full of sword lights, slashing toward Chu Fengmian from all directions. These swordsmanship were absolute killing moves, blocking Chu Fengmian's side and leaving him with no way to escape. Gu Qianjun did not intend to leave any way for Chu Fengmian. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian directly. Everyone was shocked when they saw Gu Qianjun take action. They did not expect that Gu Qianjun would dare to take action in front of Jian and I and directly kill Chu Fengmian. However, at this time, no one took action to stop Gu Qianjun. Instead, they stood aside and showed a look of amusement. Now, Chu Fengmian could be said to be the biggest threat to everyone. With Chu Fengmian's talent in swordsmanship, the Shang sword sect inheritance was likely to fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. But today, if Chu Fengmian was killed by Gu Qianjun, they would have gotten rid of one of their biggest enemies. Therefore, even though they saw Gu Qianjun taking action, they didn't have any intention to stop him. Many of them even had killing intent brewing in their eyes. It seemed that they wanted to take advantage of Chu Fengmian's crisis to kill him. Sword light filled the sky and shrouded Chu Fengmian, leaving him with no way to escape. Even an immortal marquis in the profound heaven realm might not be able to escape from the sword light, let alone an immortal general. What's more, Chu Fengmian's attention was focused on the sword principal totem, so he didn't notice Gu Qianjun's attack. Gu Qianjun seized the moment when Chu Fengmian was distracted and launched a sudden attack to kill Chu Fengmian. Gu Yu has descended. Blood will dye the world red. Gu Qianjun roared again and again. He spat out a large amount of blood essence from his mouth as a blood sacrifice to the sword. A blood-red moon appeared behind him. It was the strongest secret technique of the Gu Yu Canyon. Gu Yu descended, and blood dyed the blade red. It was as if the end of the world had arrived. This kid is finished. It's good that he's dead. We'll have a chance if he's dead. Many sword cultivators cheered in their hearts. Chu Fengmian's death was definitely a good thing for them. So what if Chu Fengmian's sword principle aptitude was strong? Aptitude in sword principle didn't represent a person's strength. Especially now, Chu Fengmian was only in the half-step celestial realm. In everyone's opinion, Chu Fengmian's weakest point was his current strength. No matter how strong his sword principle was, it was meaningless if his strength was not enough. Gu Qianjun was an immortal general expert, after all. He didn't hesitate to use his blood essence and launched a secret technique to launch a sneak attack. It was very likely that he could kill Chu Fengmian directly. Many people felt that Chu Fengmian was definitely going to die this time. Rumble. Sword light tore through the space and slashed towards Chu Fengmian, wanting to destroy everything. Want to kill me? However, just as the countless destructive swords were about to envelop Chu Fengmian, who was at the center of the countless swords, suddenly moved. The sword in his hand flashed, and in an instant, a long rainbow of sword chi swept down. Boom, boom, boom. The countless sword lights around Chu Fengmian were destroyed by the sword light. The power of the sword swept away everything. Gu Qianjun's numerous incarnations were all penetrated by the sword light. His incarnations were all killed. These incarnations were simply vulnerable in front of Chu Fengmian. He blocked it. Seeing that Chu Fengmian was standing there unscathed, Gu Qianjun's expression changed drastically. In an instant, he hurriedly retreated and turned into a beam of light, trying to escape. Gu Qianjun immediately wanted to escape after his attack failed. However, at this moment, a sword light suddenly slashed down from the sky. The sword light was not from Chu Fengmian, but from Jian and I. Jian Ni's face revealed a bit of anger. Gu Qianjun dared to make a move during the Shang sword sect's examination. This was equivalent to provoking the entire Shang sword sect. Jian and I was furious and instantly attacked. The sword light was the power of the array that enveloped the whole Shang sword sect. It turned into a sword light and slashed towards Jian and I. Although Jian and I was not a living person, his most terrifying point was that he could mobilize the power of countless arrays in the Shang sword sect. Even though these formations had existed for tens of millions of years, they were not something that a mere immortal general could resist. The speed of the sword light was extremely fast. Gu Qianjun did not manage to escape far before the sword light caught up with him and slashed at him with a loud bang. Puff! The sword light pierced into Gu Qianjun's body, and the billowing sword intent exploded. Gu Qianjun's body was torn into pieces by the sword qi at this moment. His blood essence was completely destroyed by the sword light. In a flash, Gu Qianjun's aura disappeared without a trace. He was directly killed by Jian and I. Seeing Gu Qianjun's death, everyone's face turned pale. He was an immortal general expert, but he was killed by Jian and I. Gu Qianjun did not even have a chance to escape. He was killed by Jian and I without any strength to fight back. In a chapter 2205, the Flying Sword Emperor, Xin Songtian, and the others were horrified. Just a moment ago, they were all filled with killing intent and wanted to kill Chu Fengyan. However, before they could make a move, Jian and I took the lead and killed Gu Qianjun in an instant. His attack was so fast that they didn't have time to react. They originally thought that even if Jian and I intervened, Gu Qianjun would be able to stall for some time. They never expected Jian and I to be so powerful. Although Gu Qianjun was in the immortal general realm, his true strength was comparable to an immortal marquis in the profound heaven realm. Even an immortal king or an immortal marquis couldn't kill Gu Qianjun in one move. Immortal Sage. A terrifying thought appeared in everyone's mind. Jian Ni's strength was at least comparable to a celestial sage. Jian and I didn't use his own strength to attack, but the strength to control the countless arrays and restrictions in the Upper Sword Sect ruins. However, Jian and I was able to control the array formations and restrictions in the Upper Sword Sect ruins. This also meant that Jian and I was a genuine celestial saint expert in the Upper Sword Sect ruins. Only an immortal sage could kill Gu Qianjun so easily without giving him any chance to fight back. Not only would they be able to kill Gu Qianjun, but they would also end up like Gu Qianjun if they made a move against a celestial saint expert. Death was the only way out for them. The two of them were waiting for an opportunity to attack, which saved their lives. Otherwise, Gu Qianjun wouldn't be the only one who died. How dare a puny immortal general challenge the dignity of the Upper Sword Sect? You're courting death. Jian Ni's eyes were cold as he said, "Whoever dares to attack will die." Everyone felt a chill in their hearts when they saw Jian Ni's cold eyes. After witnessing Jian Ni's strength, they had completely dispelled the idea of attacking Chu Fengyan. Not to mention the fact that Jian and I, a terrifying celestial saint expert, was standing here. The fact that he blocked Gu Qianjun's sneak attack made them understand that Chu Fengyan wasn't as easy to deal with as he seemed. Unless they had the confidence to kill Chu Fengyan in one move, they would only die if they attacked Chu Fengyan. What should we do? Are we really going to sit and watch this kid get the inheritance? The Flying Sword Emperor could not help but send a voice transmission to Xin Songtian. Originally, there was no relationship between the two of them. However, the two of them had decided to stand together in order to deal with Chu Fengyan. It's not that simple. This person might have gained some benefits now, but the person who will truly obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect will have to wait until the next stage to decide. I have a way to deal with him in the next stage. Xin Songtian's eyes flickered as he spoke. Could it be that the rumors are true? Does the Tianjin sect really know some secrets of the Shangjian sect? Upon hearing Xin Songtian's words, the Flying Sword Emperor's eyes flashed as he said, "That's right. So in a while, you and I will work together and listen to me. We still have a way to deal with this person. If this person really obtains the inheritance or leaves the Upper Sword Sect's ruins, then both of us will suffer." Xin Songtian said coldly. "All right." The Flying Sword Emperor agreed without hesitation. It was impossible for him to deal with Chu Fengyan on his own. He could only team up with Xin Songtian. Although Chu Fengyan did not know the contents of a secret conversation between Xin Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, he could tell that it was related to him. The Flying Sword Emperor and Xin Songtian had a grudge against Chu Fengyan. They would definitely not sit back and watch Chu Fengmian obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. Chu Fengmian would have felt strange if they had been quiet all the time. Let's team up. Even if you guys team up, you won't be able to stop me. Chu Fengmian looked at the flying sword emperor and Xian Sangtian. His eyes were filled with boundless confidence. His current strength was no longer the same as before. If he had encountered the flying sword emperor and Xian Sangtian when he had just arrived at the upper sword sex ruins, he would find it extremely difficult to deal with them. However, after leaving the library, Chu Fengmian's strength had increased by leaps and bounds. Even if the flying sword emperor and Xian Sangtian were to team up, Chu Fengmian would not be afraid of them. There are a total of 6 people left. The top 4, Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Flying Sword Emperor. The 4 of you have passed the test and enter the next round. Jian Ni's face was incomparably pale. Although he had just killed Gu Qianjun, there was no change in his expression. He glanced at the crowd and said calmly, "The remaining 2, according to the rules, I will now give you 2 choices. Die or be a sword slave of my upper sword sect." Upon hearing this, Brilliant Void Piercer and Sword Immortal Qin's face turned pale. In the end, it was their turn. The inheritance of the upper sword sect was extremely cruel. Once they failed, there are only 2 paths. "I'm willing to die." Sword Immortal Qin looked at Jian and I and said. He was also an expert of the sword Dao. He was unwilling to be a sword slave and would rather die. "All right." Jian and I nodded his head and waved his hand. A sword light slashed down, and the body of enlightened Sword Qin was annihilated by this sword light, leaving not a single trace of him behind. Sword Immortal Qin had fallen. "What about you?" Jian Ni's gaze fell upon Brilliant Void Piercer. "I'm willing to be a slave." Brilliant Void Piercer's face changed slightly. Every word of his was incomparably heavy. However, compared to death, Brilliant Void Piercer wanted to live more. His aptitude was considered inferior among the countless immortal generals. He had painstakingly cultivated the Heaven Piercer Dao and had assassinated countless experts. He had gone through countless life and death battles to attain his current strength. He did not want to die. "All right." Jian Ni's face was expressionless. However, there was an additional seal in his hand, and it flew into Brilliant Void Piercer's body. As the restriction entered the Kungsu Heaven Piercer's body, the Kungsu Heaven Piercer's body trembled. His face was extremely pale. He knew that once a restriction was placed on him, his life and death would no longer be in his control. "Go down." After doing all this, Jian and I waved his hand, and a spatial tunnel appeared in front of Brilliant Void Piercer. No one knew where this spatial tunnel led to. Yes. However, Brilliant Void Piercer was already a sword slave and had no right to resist. He could only listen to Jian Ni's order and stepped into the spatial tunnel, disappearing from the square. Now, other than Jian and I, only Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and Flying Sword Emperor were left. Sword Immortal Qin and Brilliant Void Piercer, 1 dead and 1 a slave. This outcome made everyone sigh incomparably. However, everyone knew that this was the cruelty of the upper sword sex inheritance. If they failed, they would also suffer the same fate. End of chapter. Chapter 2206. After all, only one person could obtain the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect. As for the rest, they were all losers. However, at this point, there was no chance to retreat. Only Chu Fengmian and the other 3 were left to compete for the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect. "All of you follow me." Jian and I glanced at the crowd and flew off into the distance with a flash. Chu Fengmian and the other 3 followed closely behind Jian and I all the way, leaping over the square and over the mountain range. The surrounding scenery was constantly changing, and finally, they arrived in front of a huge teleportation array. Jian and I was the first to step into it. Then, Chu Fengmian and the other 3 followed closely behind and stepped into the teleportation array. Suddenly, the scene in front of them spun. After a long time, Chu Fengmian woke up and looked around. This place was a planet, a huge planet. On this planet, there were tall trees that were at least 1,000 meters tall. There was an ancient aura everywhere. It made people think of the Desolation Era and the scene of the Desolation Era before it was shattered. Not only the scene, but the planet was also filled with chaotic chi, and the spatial laws were extremely ancient. It looked like a part of the Desolation Era. This is the Jade Desolation Star, one of the sacred grounds of the Shang Sword sect. In Chu Fengmian's mind, Xing Xian's voice slowly sounded. The Jade Desolation Star is a fragment of the ancient Baron's continent when it was shattered. This fragment was later obtained by an invincible expert of the Shang Sword sect. With the power of the entire sect, this fragment was refined and finally turned into a planet. The Jade Desolation Star has always been the sacred ground of the Shang Sword sect. Only the core disciples of the Shang Sword sect are qualified to enter. Since you were sent here, it seems that the next assessment will determine who will obtain the inheritance. The Jade Desolation Star, one of the sacred grounds of the Shang Sword sect. Listening to Xing Xian's words, Chu Fengmian couldn't help but look at the Jade Desolation Star. The entire Jade Desolation Star was shrouded in layers of seals. These layers of seals and arrays shrouded the sky of the Jade Desolation Star. Warriors and demon gods who had entered the Jade Desolate Star had almost no chance of escaping. Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness scanned the surroundings. The laws of the Jade Wilderness Star were extremely ancient. Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness was somewhat suppressed and could only explore the area within 100 miles. However, Chu Fengmian keenly sensed the aura of a living being in this area. In addition to Chu Fengmian and the other three, there were actually other living beings on the Jade Desolate Star, and it seemed that there were quite a lot of them. There's something strange about this place. What Chu Fengmian saw now was only the tip of the iceberg of the Jade Desolate Star, but it gave Chu Fengmian a strange feeling. Not only Chu Fengmian, but Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divine Wood Sword Emperor also looked around cautiously after they woke up. They were all observing this strange planet. This place is called the Jade Wilderness Star. It is one of the holy lands of my Upper Sword sect, and also the place where you will take your last test. While everyone was still observing the Jade Wilderness Star, Jin and I suddenly appeared, looked at everyone, and said coldly, "This test is to determine who will eventually obtain the Upper Sword sect's inheritance." Everyone listened to Jian and I quietly, fearing that they would forget any of the contents. Everyone's expression was extremely serious. This test was to determine the ownership of the Upper Sword sect's inheritance. Everyone had gone through countless difficulties and dangers to finally reach this step, all for the sake of obtaining the Upper Sword sect's inheritance. Now, the inheritance was placed in front of everyone. Now, my Upper Sword sect's strongest sword technique, the unparalleled sword technique, is on this planet. Whoever can obtain this unparalleled sword technique will be qualified to obtain the Upper Sword sect's inheritance. Jian and I glanced at the crowd and said coldly, "As for the remaining people, all those who fail will fall." Although everyone had guessed this point, they still felt a chill in their hearts when they heard Jian Ni's words. Among the 4 people present, only one could obtain the Upper Sword sect's inheritance. As for the remaining 3, they would definitely fall. Moreover, this test was even more cruel than the previous ones. They did not even have the right to choose. There was only one path, which was the path of death. Unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique is actually on this planet? Chu Fengmian's mind raced after he heard Jian Ni's words. He had not expected the last test to be like this. Whoever could obtain the unparalleled sword technique would be able to obtain the Upper Sword sect's inheritance. However, in Jian Ni's words, other than mentioning that the unparalleled sword technique was on this planet, there was no other information. Although this planet was not the largest, it was equivalent to the size of one of the 9 domains. Searching for a sword technique on this planet was no different from searching for a needle in a haystack. Sir Jian and I wonder if there is any sign of the unparalleled sword technique? Xian Songtian asked respectfully. Yes, when there is a 7-colored light on this planet, it means that the unparalleled sword technique is nearby. Jian and I said slowly, Go and fight for it." Whoever can obtain the unparalleled sword technique will be qualified to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. After Jian and I finished his sentence, his figure disappeared completely. Let's go. In an instant, the four of them turned into streaks of light and flew in different directions. Whoever could obtain the unparalleled sword technique will be able to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. It was a race against time. No one wanted to be slower than the others. Although there were four figures, there were actually 3 rays of light. Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had indeed teamed up, as Lin Fan had guessed. The 4 rays of light separated for the time being. Unparalleled sword technique. Where is the unparalleled sword technique hidden? Where did the 7-colored light appear? Could it be that the unparalleled sword technique has also become a sword spirit? Chu Fengmian muttered to himself as he flew, searching for the traces of the unparalleled sword technique. Previously, when Chu Fengmian was in the book collection pavilion, he had seen a large number of sword techniques that had already given birth to a sword spirit. If the unparalleled sword technique had also given birth to a sword spirit, it would be extremely troublesome. The more mysterious the sword technique, the more powerful the sword spirit that was born from it. The unparalleled sword technique was one of the top 10 ancient supreme immortal techniques. Its power was not inferior to the number 1 sword technique. If a sword spirit was born, the strength of the unparalleled sword technique's sword spirit would be extremely terrifying. It would be far beyond the immortal general, immortal marquis, or even an immortal king or immortal duke. End of chapter. Chapter 2207. If this peerless sword art were to give birth to a sword spirit, even if Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divine Wood Sword Emperor join forces, they might not be a match for the sword spirit of this peerless sword art. Chu Fengmian had also experienced the power of the 10 supreme ancient sword arts from the first sword art. It was definitely far beyond ordinary sword arts, and even immortal emperor sword arts. In the past, countless sword emperors had created hundreds of sword arts. However, only a few of them were qualified to be listed in the 10 supreme ancient immortal arts. Chu Fengmian did not dare to underestimate the existence of this peerless sword art. Impossible. The peerless sword art needs millions of years to give birth to a sword spirit. It's still far from that. Hearing Chu Fengmian's words, Xian suddenly sneered in his mind. You should know that the stronger the existence, the more it's not allowed by the world. It's impossible for the peerless sword art to give birth to a sword spirit without millions of years. You don't have to worry. The stronger the existence, the more it's not allowed by the world. When Chu Fengmian heard this, he muttered to himself. Yes, Chu Fengmian also deeply understood this point. Every time he broke through, it was thousands of times more difficult than ordinary martial artists and demon gods. Therefore, with his current strength, he did not dare to rashly attempt the celestial tribulation. If this peerless sword art could give birth to a sword spirit, it would definitely be one of the most heaven-defying existences in the world. It might even become an immortal emperor in the future. It was precisely because of this peerless sword art that his chances of giving birth to a sword spirit were so slim. While Chu Fengmian was deep in thought, a huge figure suddenly appeared in front of him. It was a giant bird 1,000 feet tall. It flew to Chu Fengmian's side and spread its wings, covering the sky and splitting the sun. Suddenly, it opened its mouth and tried to devour Chu Fengmian. The giant bird's face showed a bit of anger. It opened its mouth and tried to devour Chu Fengmian. Furious owl, Chu Fengmian's figure flashed and immediately dodged the giant bird's attack. At the same time, his gaze fell on the giant bird. He sized it up and recognized its identity. Chu Fengmian had never seen the giant bird in front of him before. However, in some ancient books, Chu Fengmian had heard some records of the giant bird. The giant bird was called Nu Shao, and it was an ancient desolate beast. In the antiquity age, even an ordinary Nu Shao had the strength of a celestial being. The king of the Nu Shao clan was no weaker than the experts of Xian Songtian. Even though Nu Shao wasn't the king of the Nu Shao tribe, he was still a powerful Nu Shao. His speed was much faster than most immortal generals. If Chu Fengmian had reacted a little slower, he would have been buried in this furious owl's mouth. This wild beast that has been extinct for millions of years actually exists on the Jade Desolate Star. Chu Fengmian was a little shocked, but the sword in his hand didn't stop. It suddenly came out of the scabbard and turned into a sword, slashing towards Nu Xiao. Hua! The sword came out of the scabbard and slashed at Nu Xiao's wings. However, Chu Fengmian's sword was blocked by the wings. There was only a sword mark left on the wings. The sword didn't manage to slash through Nu Xiao's wings. It is indeed a true desolate beast. Such a body is really strong. Chu Fengmian sighed in his heart when he saw the wound caused by the sword. Desolate beasts could be said to be the true overlords of the Antiquity Age. The word desolate in the Antiquity Age referred to desolate beasts. Compared to the demonic beast clan, desolate beasts didn't have consciousness. Usually, only the king of the desolate beast clan had consciousness and could converse with humans. Most of the desolate beasts only knew how to fight based on their instincts. For the demonic beast clan, as long as they stepped into the divine power realm, they would gain intelligence and could transform into human form. Their intelligence wouldn't be lower than human warriors. However, for many desolate beasts, no matter how strong they couldn't transform into human form. It was extremely rare for them to have consciousness and be able to converse with humans. It was because of this that although the desolate beast clan didn't have consciousness, they had extremely strong battle instincts and incomparably strong bodies. It was almost impossible for them to defeat a desolate beast of the same realm. Chu Fengmian's previous sword strike could kill most immortal generals. However, it only left a shallow sword mark on Nu Xiao's wings. The feathers of Nu Xiao were much harder than ordinary immortal artifacts. After fighting with a desolate beast, Chu Fengmian understood that the records of desolate beasts in the ancient books weren't exaggerated at all. Nu Xiao was in pain, and the anger on its face grew. It flapped its wings, and its huge body charged towards Chu Fengmian. To the desolate beast clan, their bodies were the best weapons. Nu Xiao's sudden charge could shatter 1,000 zhang tall mountain. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. The sword in his hand changed. Suddenly, the moment the sword fell, thousands of sword shadows fell. The 10,000 sword shadows slashed at the same spot on Furious Owl's wings, which was equivalent to Furious Owl withstanding 10,000 sword shadows in an instant. No matter how tough his body was, he wouldn't be able to withstand 10,000 sword shadows. Whoosh! Nu Xiao's body exploded in the air. Devour! Chu Fengmian's mind moved. He immediately activated the sky-devouring secret technique and devoured all of Nu Xiao's essence and blood. The essence and blood of this desolate beast contains a huge amount of power. It's just right for me to increase my strength. The essence blood contained in the Raging Owl was almost on par with the essence blood of the Heavenly Saint Sword Emperor. After being devoured by the heaven-devouring secret technique, it immediately surged into Chu Fengmian's body and turned into his power. Now that Chu Fengmian's sword principle had improved, his strength was now qualified to break through the celestial tribulation. What he lacked was spiritual power. Devouring Nu Xiao's essence and blood was increasing Chu Fengmian's spiritual power. At the same time, not only Nu Xiao's essence and blood, but his feathers were also put into the empty ring by Chu Fengmian. The feathers of Nu Xiao were harder than ordinary immortal weapons. If these feathers were refined into an immortal weapon, it would definitely be a powerful immortal armor. The moment Chu Fengmian killed the Nu Xiao, suddenly more huge figures flew over from the distance. It was actually several more Nu Xiao. These Nu Xiao seemed to have been attracted by the fluctuations of the battle just now. When they saw Chu Fengmian, they immediately showed a fierce look, opened their mouths, and rushed towards Chu Fengmian. End of chapter. Chapter 2208. Good timing. Chu Fengmian's expression did not change at the sight of so many furious owls. These furious owls contain an enormous amount of blood essence. This blood essence could be turned into spiritual power to increase Chu Fengmian's strength. It was extremely rare to find one or two of these wild beasts in the current era. Unexpectedly, there were groups of furious owls on the Jade Desolate Star. Furious owls were wild beasts that lived in groups. According to ancient records in the Desolation era, some groups of furious owls had tens of millions of them. When they attacked together, they hunted warriors and demon gods. Even some ultimate heaven realm experts would be in danger if they encountered a group of furious owls. However, the number of furious owls in front of him was far less than that. There were only 7 or 8 of them. Even if they joined forces, Chu Fengmian was not afraid at all. Chu Fengmian brandished his 2 swords and displayed his swordsmanship. For a moment, the sky was filled with flickering sword shadows. Every time a sword shadow fell, it meant that a furious owl had been killed. On the spot, 4 of the furious owls were killed by Chu Fengmian. The blood essence of these furious owls was directly absorbed by Chu Fengmian and poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The feathers on their bodies were all stored in Chu Fengmian's empty ring. After devouring so much blood essence, Chu Fengmian felt that his strength was increasing by about 5%. The blood essence of these furious owls had all been turned into spiritual power and poured into Chu Fengmian's blood vessels. The blood essence of each furious owl that was killed by Chu Fengmian became a part of Chu Fengmian's strength. Chu Fengmian killed more than half of the furious owls in the blink of an eye. The rest of the furious owls also knew that Chu Fengmian was in danger. Their eyes showed some fear as they turned around and flapped their wings, fleeing in all directions. Although these furious owls did not have consciousness, they still had instincts. When they encountered danger, they wanted to escape immediately. Want to escape? Chu Fengmian sneered. His figure flickered again and again as he chased after the fleeing furious owls. In Chu Fengmian's view, these furious owls were all great nourishment. Their blood essence could be turned into Chu Fengmian's strength. Of course, Chu Fengmian would not let them go. After killing a huge number of void beasts and devouring a lot of mystical void crystals in the depths of the void, Qi Nan and the rest of the mystical void crystals. Right now, Chu Fengmian's control over the Tao of space had far surpassed the immortal generals and even the immortal Marquis realm. The speed of his escape light was comparable to the 5th level of the immortal king realm. Although these furious owls were desolate beasts with immense strength, and their flying speed was extremely fast, they were incomparable to Chu Fengmian's escape light. In just a few breaths, Chu Fengmian had caught up to the fleeing furious owls. The sword in his hand flashed repeatedly as he slew the furious owls. Their blood essences were completely devoured by Chu Fengmian. Swallow, the heaven-devouring secret skill, was activated. Immediately, the impurities within the furious owl's essence blood were all removed. The remaining essence blood was no longer scarlet in color. Instead, it was green-blue in color. After being refined by the heaven-devouring secret skill, the furious owl's essence blood no longer contained the slightest power of a desolate beast. What was left was pure spiritual power, which was directly devoured by Chu Fengmian in one breath. Good. My strength has increased by about 10%. If I can hunt more desolate beasts, I will have the confidence to break through the celestial tribulation on the Jade Desolate Star. Chu Fengmian could not help but say as he felt the increase in his strength. There were many desolate beasts on the Jade Desolate Star, much more than what Chu Fengmian had sensed before. While chasing these furious owls, Chu Fengmian felt countless ancient auras. A large number of desolate beasts were hiding in the forest of giant trees below. Among these desolate beasts, many of them emitted auras that made Chu Fengmian extremely fearful. Even if Chu Fengmian took action, you might not be able to do anything to those desolate beasts. The strongest of the desolate beast clan was even comparable to the heaven realm, celestial sage, and even immortal venerables. Although there might not be such desolate beasts on the Jade Desolate Star, even some of the profound heaven realm level desolate beasts would be extremely troublesome for Chu Fengmian if he encountered them. And now, Chu Fengmian did not intend to waste time on hunting these desolate beasts. His top priority was to find the unparalleled sword technique and obtain the inheritance of the highest sword sect. Finding the unparalleled sword technique on the Jade Desolate Star is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Chu Fengmian said with a frown. While chasing after the furious owl, Chu Fengmian also opened his spiritual consciousness to search for the unparalleled sword technique, but to no avail. Given the size of the Jade Desolate Star, it would be impossible for Chu Fengmian to thoroughly search the entire Jade Desolate Star without a few months. And in these few months, who knew if the unparalleled sword technique would be obtained by the divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian Sangtian, or the Flying Sword Emperor? Unparalleled sword technique. Since this unparalleled sword technique is the most powerful sword technique in the Upper Sword sect, it is impossible for it not to reveal a little bit of its aura, unless the aura of this unparalleled sword technique was deliberately concealed. Chu Fengmian's mind was spinning rapidly. Generally, some natural treasures would emit aura if they fell into a planet. Such an unparalleled sword technique was on the Jade Desolate Star. Logically speaking, it was impossible for it to be so quiet, unless the aura of this unparalleled sword technique was deliberately concealed. Upper Sword Sect, yes, this unparalleled sword chi is from the Upper Sword Sect. I wonder if this unparalleled sword chi can find the unparalleled sword technique. Chu Fengmian suddenly thought. There was a key thing on his body, which was the unparalleled sword chi. This unparalleled sword chi was once the most precious treasure of the Upper Sword sect. With the unparalleled sword chi, it was possible to find the unparalleled sword technique. Go! Chu Fengmian's mind moved, and immediately the 2,815 unparalleled sword chi scattered and flew out, searching for the existence of the unparalleled sword technique. On the Jade Desolate Star, apart from Chu Fengmian and the other three, there were only endless wild beasts left. Although Chu Fengmian did not know the aura of the unparalleled sword technique, as long as he went to explore the area that contained sword intent, it would most likely be the hiding place of the unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique, which was ranked among the top 10 ancient celestial immortal techniques, had a sharp sword intent that could not be completely concealed. Moreover, the unparalleled sword chi, as a sword principal treasure, was extremely sensitive to sword intent. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding area was completely explored. End of chapter. Chapter 2209. Not a single trace of sword intent could be found within a radius of 1,000 miles. Continue. Chu Fengmian was not in a hurry. He continued to urge the supreme sword chi to search in all directions. The 2,815 strands of supreme sword chi spread out to search, but it was much faster than Chu Fengmian searching alone. Moreover, Chu Fengmian did not expect to find traces of the unparalleled sword technique very quickly. Since Jian and I had used the Jade Desolate Star as the final assessment place, it was naturally impossible for others to find the unparalleled sword technique so easily. Moreover, there were dangers everywhere on the Jade Desolate Star. A large number of desolate beasts inhabited the place. The supreme sword chi that Chu Fengmian had dispersed had been targeted by some desolate beasts and had almost been captured by them. Fortunately, these supreme sword chi had all recognized him as their master. Chu Fengmian's control of these supreme sword chi was also extremely high. When he encountered danger, he could directly withdraw the supreme sword chi. However, in just a few hours, Chu Fengmian discovered more than a dozen wild beasts whose strength had stepped into the mysterious heaven realm. There was even an ancient rock divine lizard whose strength had reached the immortal king realm. Whether it was Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, or the divine Wood Sword Emperor who encountered this ancient rock divine lizard, it boded ill rather than well. Why are there so many wild beasts living on the Jade Desolate Star? Many wild beasts have even given birth to tribes. The more Chu Fengmian looked at the Jade Desolate Star, the more surprised he was. He had never thought that he could see such a planet in this era. This is not strange. When the Desolation era was broken, the invincible expert of the Upper Sword sect not only collected such a fragment and turned it into the Jade Desolate Star, but also captured many wild beasts in the Desolation era and raised them on the Jade Desolate Star. Xian explained, "This Jade Desolate Star has always been a holy land for the disciples of the Upper Sword sect to train and cultivate. They fight and kill the desolate beasts. However, after tens of millions of years, the Jade Desolate Star has been sealed off. The desolate beasts inside have multiplied, and it is not surprising that some powerful desolate beasts are born. Unfortunately, these wild beasts cannot be used by me. Otherwise, if all the wild beasts on the Jade Desolate Star were born, it would be enough to sweep the entire 9 regions. Chu Fengyan said to himself, subduing a desolate beast? This is something that is nearly impossible. Even in the primordial era, there were few mighty figures that could tame a desolate beast. The desolate beast bloodline is destined to be impossible to tame. Xing Xian shook his head. However, that might not be the case for you. You have inherited the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast and are in control of the heaven-devouring source energy. It might not be impossible for you to subdue a desolate beast. The heaven-devouring beast is the ancestor of the desolate beasts. All the desolate beasts in the world have inherited the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast. Your bloodline is extremely effective against these desolate beasts. It's just that your current cultivation level is too low. The power of the heaven-devouring beast bloodline has yet to be fully revealed. If you step into the celestial realm and reveal your heaven-devouring beast bloodline, those raging owls won't dare to attack you. Chu Fengyan nodded. He also knew that Xing Xian was right. Although Chu Fengyan had encountered countless fortuitous encounters and had even become a mutated species of heaven and earth, obtaining the origin powers of the 3 great innate divine beasts, the dark whale, the heaven-devouring beast, and the ancestral sky dragon. Chu Fengyan's cultivation level was still too low. Chu Fengyan could mobilize less than 1% of the true power of the origin of the 3 innate divine beasts. As long as Chu Fengyan stepped into the celestial realm, he could really mobilize the origin of the 3 innate divine beasts. Chu Fengyan had already decided that after obtaining the unparalleled sword art and the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect, he would immediately go into seclusion to break through the celestial tribulation. I found the trace. At this moment, Chu Fengyan's face suddenly changed slightly. He suddenly felt the existence of a little sword essence in one of the supreme sword chi. In this jade wilderness star, the existence that contained sword essence was most likely the unparalleled sword art. In an instant, Chu Fengyan's figure flickered again and flew directly in the direction of the supreme sword chi. In a few minutes, Chu Fengyan flew to the place where the supreme sword chi was located. Just below Chu Fengyan was a huge valley. Although it was called a valley, it was still thousands of feet wide and could be considered extremely huge. However, on the Jade Desolate Star, such a canyon was nothing. There are no wild beasts around here. Chu Fengyan observed the surroundings of the valley and frowned. The surroundings of the valley were extremely desolate. Even with Chu Fengyan's spiritual awareness, he did not find any wild beast's aura. Wild beasts lived everywhere on the Jade Desolate Star. It was strange that there was no aura of any wild beast in the surroundings of such a canyon. Only if there was an even more powerful existence in the valley would the other desolate beasts not dare to approach it. With my current spiritual awareness, even a wild beast of the Immortal King realm can't hide from my spiritual awareness. Could it be that the wild beast occupying this valley is stronger than the Immortal King realm? Above the Immortal King realm was the peak of the mysterious heaven realm, the Immortal Monarch realm. If there was really a wild beast of the Immortal Monarch realm in this valley, then if Chu Fengyan approached it easily, this wild beast could kill Chu Fengyan in one blow. Although Chu Fengyan's strength was comparable to an Immortal Marquis, he was still 2 realms away from the Immortal Monarch realm. Such a realm was not something that Chu Fengyan's various opportunities could contend with. However, when Chu Fengyan approached the valley, he could clearly feel a sword essence emanating from this valley. It was very likely that the unparalleled sword art was in this valley. Chu Fengyan was also hesitating whether to go in or not. Someone is coming. However, at this moment, Chu Fengyan suddenly felt 2 figures flying over. Chu Fengyan hurriedly hid his aura and hid in the space. He glanced over and saw that the two figures were Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor. The two of them had just arrived on the Jade Wilderness Star and had joined forces. No one knew what they were planning. Chu Fengmian did not expect to see the two of them so soon. The two of them were actually just a little slower than Chu Fengmian. They had also arrived near this valley and looked in the direction that the two of them had flown all the way here. The two of them did not search for a bit by bit like Chu Fengmian. Instead, they seemed to have known from the beginning that the unparalleled sword art was in this valley and had flown all the way here. Chapter 22:10. This made Chu Fengmian extremely surprised. He had used the supreme sword chi to search in different directions before he finally found this valley. But now, the Flying Sword Emperor was swaggering over from the mysterious firmament heaven. Could Xian Songtian have known about the location of the unparalleled sword technique? Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered. He knew that the unparalleled sword technique could only be from Xian Songtian and not the Flying Sword Emperor. The Tianjin sect had been destroyed for millions of years, and the news of the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect had only been spread from the Tianjin sect. It was said that the Tianjin sect had obtained a portion of the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. This allowed the Tianjin sect to rise from an unknown sect in the 9 regions to one of the 7 great sects of the 9 regions. This rumor was half true and half false. However, judging from Xian Songtian's performance, this rumor was probably true. Let's see what the two of them want to do first. Chu Fengmian hid in the void. He was not in a hurry to reveal himself. Chu Fengmian was originally considering whether to enter the valley to investigate, but he was also worried that there would be danger. Now that Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had arrived, Chu Fengmian could also see if the two of them would enter the valley. Chu Fengmian could also wait at the side for an opportunity. Brother Xian, is the unparalleled sword technique in the valley before us. Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor flew towards the valley. As they got closer to the valley, Chu Fengmian could clearly hear their conversation. The Flying Sword Emperor had followed Xian Songtian all the way and had already lowered his stance. He had already regarded Xian Songtian as his master. This was something that the Flying Sword Emperor could not do anything about. Among the 4 of them, the Flying Sword Emperor was the weakest, and he had the least hope of obtaining the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. If he wanted to live, he could only rely on one of them. The Flying Sword Emperor had a grudge against Chu Fengmian, and it was impossible for him to rely on Chu Fengmian. On the other hand, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had always been a lone wolf and was not suitable either. Regardless, the Flying Sword Emperor could only rely on Xian Songtian and stand together with him. Xian Songtian wanted a deal with Chu Fengmian. With the death of Gu Qianjun, he lacked manpower. It was a good thing for him to have the help of the Flying Sword Emperor. Naturally, the two of them hit it off and joined forces. However, Xian Songtian was clearly the leader of this alliance. That's right. I can feel that the unparalleled sword technique is in this valley. When Xian Songtian heard Flying Sword Emperor's words, he said coldly, Chu Fengmian would never have thought that even if he had the upper hand in the beginning, he would have wasted all his previous efforts. The patriarchs of the Tianjin sect had already guessed the content of this test, so they gave me the unparalleled sword ring. As Xian Songtian spoke, he touched the ring on his right finger. The ring was simple and looked extremely ordinary. It was no different from an ordinary ancient ring. It was so inconspicuous that Chu Fengmian did not notice it before. However, when he heard the ring's name, Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but observe the empty ring on Xian Songtian's hand. Unparalleled sword ring. The reason why Xian Songtian could find this valley was related to the unparalleled sword ring in his hand. Moreover, the name was most likely related to the unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique, the strongest sword technique of the Shang Sword sect, was one of the 10 supreme ancient immortal techniques. It was created by the founder of the Shang Sword sect, the strongest immortal emperor of the Shang Sword sect, the unparalleled Sword Emperor. The unparalleled sword ring was also related to the unparalleled Sword Emperor. Although I can't fully activate the power of the unparalleled sword ring, it's still easy for me to sense the location of the unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique is indeed in this valley. Xian Songtian said again. He was sizing up the valley in front of him. Then what are we waiting for? Let's go in directly. Once we obtain the unparalleled sword technique, Brother Xian will become the successor of the Shang Sword sect, and you can kill Chu Fengyan. As for me, I will have to rely on Brother Xian in the future. The Flying Sword Emperor said hurriedly. Don't worry. Once I obtain the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect, I will not treat you unfairly. At that time, I will let you join our Tianjin sect. Our Tianjin sect is not only one of the 7 great sects of the 9 domains. We are also related to the 9 domains. We are a Sacred Region sect. Xian Songtian said proudly. Sacred Region sect. Hearing these words, the Flying Sword Emperor's face was filled with excitement. In the eyes of all the martial artists and demon gods, the Sacred Region was a high and mighty existence. Anyone who could join a Sacred Region sect would have a bright future. For example, in the extraterritorial starry sky, an ordinary heavenly human realm martial artist was a high and mighty existence. An immortal general was the overlord of a star region. However, in the Sacred Region sect, a heavenly human realm martial artist was just an ordinary disciple. As for an immortal general, he was just a figure and was far from being an expert. The heritage of the Sacred Region sect, the records of the sword techniques, and the cultivation techniques were not comparable to those that were circulated outside. The reason why the Flying Sword Emperor was willing to join Xian Songtian was because Xian Songtian was from the Tianjin sect. Let's go. Let's go in first and obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Then, we will go back and look for Jin and I and let him kill Chu Fengyan. Let Chu Fengyan die on the Jade Desolate Star to prevent any more trouble. Xian Songtian observed the valley before he said. Then, he gradually descended and stepped into the valley. The Flying Sword Emperor followed closely behind him. Both of them entered the valley. They really went in. Looking at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor's figure entered the valley, Chu Fengyan gradually revealed himself. Xian Songtian actually has the unparalleled sword ring. Such a treasure can directly find the unparalleled sword technique. I almost died in the hands of this person. Chu Fengyan looked at the back of Xian Songtian, and there was a lingering fear in his heart. If Chu Fengyan was still unaware, Xian Songtian would have already obtained the unparalleled sword technique and the inheritance of the Supreme Sword sect. Chu Fengyan and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were going to die on the Jade Desolate Star. After all, once Jian and I took action, an unparalleled celestial saint, Chu Fengyan and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor would not be able to survive in his hands. Fortunately, Chu Fengyan's luck was good as he found the valley before Xian Songtian. Let's go. Chu Fengyan's figure moved quietly and hid in the void. He quietly followed behind Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Chapter 22:11. Xian Songtian's strength was not to be underestimated. He was a peerless genius that had been carefully nurtured by the Tianjin sect. For Xian Songtian, the Tianjin sect had paid a huge price to obtain the Upper Sword Execution Order portrait. They had even made an exception and passed down the Flying Celestial Sword Art, the supreme technique of the Tianjin sect. Now, even the unparalleled sword ring had been given to Xian Songtian. It was obvious that the Tianjin sect valued Xian Songtian. The Tianjin sect foundation was unfathomable. It was even related to the rumored Tianzhou domain. Chu Fengyan did not dare to underestimate Xian Songtian. Chu Fengyan hid his body and followed Xian Songtian 100 feet away. Although they were 1,000 feet apart, Chu Fengyan's 5 senses, every movement of Xian Songtian and their conversation couldn't escape his eyes. Chu Fengyan also followed Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor into the valley. Chu Fengyan was worried that there would be danger in the valley. Hence, he did not enter rashly. Now that Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had entered the valley, they could help Chu Fengyan explore the dangers in the valley. If there was no danger, Chu Fengyan could take action immediately and snatch the unparalleled sword technique. Given Chu Fengyan's current strength, it would not be a problem to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the two of them. Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, Even if the two of you join forces and plot for half a day, the unparalleled sword technique will still fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. Chu Fengmian's lips curled into a cold smile. However, he had already completely hidden his body in the surrounding space. There was no fluctuation that could be transmitted out. Xian, Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were extremely cautious when they entered the valley. They walked step by step into the valley, not daring to rush in rashly. It was indeed strange that there were no traces of any desolate beasts in the valley. Xian Songtian could sense that the unparalleled sword technique was in the valley with the help of the unparalleled sword ring. However, he did not know what exactly was hidden in the valley. However, Chu Fengmian could sense that there was an invisible force that shrouded the sky above the valley. His spiritual consciousness was suppressed within it. If they were outside, they wouldn't be able to use their spiritual sense to explore the valley. He could only step into it and observe it with his own eyes. Chu Fengmian followed mysterious Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor all the way to the depths of the valley. The valleys on both sides of the valley became wider and wider until they reached the deepest part. A huge cave appeared before Chu Fengmian's eyes. The cave was thousands of feet long and wide and could accommodate a huge creature. The unparalleled sword art is in this cave. As they approached the cave, everyone could clearly feel the sword intent that was emitted from the cave. The sword intent was so strong that it actually took the form of numerous spiritual swords when it appeared. Just the sword will that appeared was enough to take form. Only the unparalleled sword art, one of the 10 supreme immortal arts of the antiquity times, could possess such power. Without needing to enter the cave, Chu Fengmian could confirm that the unparalleled sword art was indeed in the cave. Not only Chu Fengmian, but Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor also noticed it immediately. They looked into the cave and saw that it was pitch black. Their faces were filled with fear. In the valley, spiritual consciousness could not be spread out at all. As such, no one knew what was hidden in the cave. After stepping into the immortal general realm, although their 5 senses were thousands of times better than ordinary people, it was still difficult to see what was hidden in the pitch-black cave. Since we are already here, there is no reason to leave. Moreover, if the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Chu Fengmian discover this cave, it will be troublesome. Let's go in directly. Xian Songtian's eyes flickered, and there was a hint of madness in his eyes. Wealth came from danger. No matter what, he was the first to discover the cave. Naturally, he could not delay until Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor arrived. Not only Chu Fengmian, but the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's strength was also unfathomable. Although Xian Songtian's sword principle had surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor in the previous round, it did not represent his true strength. Xian Songtian did not want to delay any longer. If we join forces, we can retreat directly if we encounter any danger. The Flying Sword Emperor nodded. The two of them took out their spiritual swords and walked into the cave together. Looking at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor walking into the cave, Chu Fengmian also stopped outside the cave and did not enter rashly. However, Chu Fengmian was fully focused on every movement in the cave. No sound could escape his ears. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, time passed by bit. Since Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had entered the cave, there had been no commotion. Although Chu Fengmian's face was as calm as possible, there was still some anxiety in his heart. If there was nothing in the cave and Xian Songtian obtained the unparalleled sword principle, everything would be over. At that time, the Supreme Sword Sect's inheritance would fall into Xian Songtian's hands. The first person that Xian Songtian wanted to kill would be Chu Fengmian. Boom! Just as Chu Fengmian was getting anxious and was about to enter the cave, a sudden roar resounded. Inside the cave, the earth quaked and the mountains shook. Immortal energy exploded within the cave. Waves of aftershocks erupted from the cave. Let's go. Swoosh. In an instant, 2 figures flew out of the cave. These 2 figures were Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor who had just entered the cave. The 2 of them flew out of the cave in horror. At a glance, more than half of their bodies had disappeared without a trace. It was as if more than half of their bodies had been bitten off, and they looked extremely miserable. In order to escape from the cave, the two of them did not spare any energy to reconstruct their bodies. Obviously, the two of them had fallen into an extremely dangerous situation. That was why they had escaped in such a hurry. There's something in the cave. Chu Fengmian's figure retreated and hid in a corner of the valley. He saw that when Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor left the cave, a huge figure rushed out of the cave. This figure was 1,000 feet tall. It was completely white and looked like a wolf. However, there was a pair of wings on its back. It was a desolate beast that rushed out of the cave. Ancient Desolate White Wolf. Calm. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 22:12. Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat when he saw the huge figure. There was an ancient desolation white wolf in the cave. Moreover, it was an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf. Chu Fengmian had guessed that there might be an unparalleled desolate beast hiding in the valley. He did not expect Chu Fengmian to be able to guess it. The ancient desolation white wolf was one of the overlords of the desolate beast race during the Desolate Era. It was one of the most powerful desolate beast races. Once an ancient desolation white wolf reached adulthood, its strength would be at least at the immortal lord realm. Such a creature was unimaginable in the current era. The ancient desolation white wolf strength would be comparable to an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf. Some powerful ancient desolation white wolves could even reach the immortal lord realm, let alone the immortal lord realm. The most powerful wolf king could even reach the heavenly realm. It could reach the immortal saint realm or even the immortal reverent realm. The ancient desolation white wolf was a completely different existence from the desolate beast that Chu Fengmian had encountered before. It was a desolate beast with an incomparably noble bloodline. It was extremely rare even during the Desolate Era. There was actually an ancient desolation white wolf hiding in the cave. Moreover, it was an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf. It was no wonder that Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor were running away in a hurry. The ancient desolation white wolf could kill an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf in a single blow. There was still some blood flowing from the corner of the ancient desolation white wolf's mouth. Apparently, half of the flesh of Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor had been bitten off by the ancient desolation white wolf in the cave. The fact that Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor could escape from the ancient desolation white wolf's mouth was already considered extremely cautious. Otherwise, they would have been eaten by the ancient desolation white wolf. Damn it, ancient desolation white wolf. It's actually an ancient desolation white wolf. Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor cursed as they escaped from the cave. They quickly ran out of the valley. Escaping from the cave was far from safe for the two of them. The ancient desolation white wolf chased after them. The ancient desolation white wolf had a pair of wings on its back, and its flying speed was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he turned into a beam of white light and chased after Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. The ancient desolate white wolf left? Chu Fengmian watched as the ancient desolate white wolf chased after the Flying Sword Emperor. Chu Fengmian suddenly felt extremely excited. Since the primordial white wolf had left the cave, it meant that there was no longer any defense in the cave. Furthermore, the unparalleled sword technique was in the cave. This was an excellent opportunity for Chu Fengmian. Fortune comes from danger. Let's go all out. Chu Fengmian moved and flew into the cave without hesitation. He knew that the opportunity would only come in the blink of an eye. With the speed of the ancient desolation white wolf, once it caught up to Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Monarch, they would be killed instantly. Once the ancient desolation white wolf returned, Chu Fengmian would be in extreme danger. The ancient desolation white wolf was comparable to an invincible expert in the immortal realm. Even if Chu Fengmian had passed the Sky Man Great Tribulation, he might not be a match for the ancient desolation white wolf, let alone the current Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian might die in the hands of the ancient desolation white wolf. However, since Chu Fengmian had decided to go all out, he had to make the best use of his time. He could not afford to waste a single second. The cave was extremely dark, but Chu Fengmian could barely see the scene inside. Chu Fengmian went all the way to the deepest part of the cave and saw an ancient book placed on a stone platform. On the page of the ancient book, there were two big words, unparalleled. Unparalleled sword technique. This is the unparalleled sword technique. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the unparalleled sword art, he immediately used the battle dragon claw to grab the unparalleled sword art. How dare you steal the sword technique? Die! Just as Chu Fengmian displayed the unparalleled swordsmanship, an angry roar suddenly came from behind. Chu Fengmian hurriedly looked back and saw a huge figure rushing into the cave. It was the ancient desolation White Wolf. Almost in a breath's time, the ancient desolation White Wolf sensed Chu Fengmian's aura and returned to the cave. Its speed was beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. Following the ancient desolation White Wolf's roar, the surrounding space condensed and turned into sharp blades that slashed at Chu Fengmian. The ancient desolation White Wolf was one of the few desolation beasts that majored in space. Its control of space had reached an incredible level. The space around Chu Fengmian was condensed and harder than steel. It was impossible to tear it apart. Chu Fengmian wanted to tear the space apart and escape, but he failed. Damn it! The ancient desolation White Wolf is too fast. As long as Chu Fengmian had a second, he could enter the cave, take away the unparalleled sword art, and run away. However, the ancient desolation White Wolf was too fast. The moment Chu Fengmian entered the cave, the ancient desolation White Wolf rushed back. The sharp blades condensed by space tore the space apart at an extremely fast speed, leaving Chu Fengmian no time to react. Sky devouring. Immortal. In a split second, Chu Fengmian's immortal real body and 129,600 immortal crystals all operated. The immortal secret technique was fully activated, pushing Chu Fengmian's power to the extreme. All the power was injected into the 129,600 immortal crystals to protect Chu Fengmian's body. At the same time, the sky-devouring power burst out and turned into a huge black hole that shrouded Chu Fengmian's body, trying its best to resist the sharp blades that slashed at him. At the same time, the power of Ancestor Tianlong and the power of the mysterious whale burst out from Chu Fengmian's body and were injected into the two swords. The two swords slashed out at the same time. Chu Fengmian unleashed all of his power to resist the sharp blade that was slashing towards him. Rumble. The sharp blades condensed by space contained unimaginable power. Chu Fengmian's sky-devouring secret technique was shattered in an instant. Even though Chu Fengmian controlled the sky-devouring origin and used the sky-devouring secret technique, he could not devour such tyrannical power and was shattered in an instant. The next moment, the sharp blades collided with Chu Fengmian's two swords. Calm. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 2213. Crack. Crack. When the spatial blades collided with Chu Fengmian's swords, Chu Fengmian's body was the first to shatter. Both of Chu Fengmian's arms were instantly shattered by the power that was transmitted over. In Chu Fengmian's body, the 129,600 immortal crystals formed an invincible defense. Now, the immortal crystals on the edges began to shatter one by one. The primordial desolation White Wolf was an overlord among the Desolation Beast clan. Its strength was enough to surpass martial artists and demon immortals of the same realm. The power of these spatial blades surpassed any attack Chu Fengmian had ever seen before. If the two spiritual swords in Chu Fengmian's hands were ordinary immortal weapons, they would have broken in an instant. Ordinary immortal weapons couldn't withstand the collision of power. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and the Titanic Godly Sword were once only heaven-grade spiritual weapons, but they had been with Chu Fengmian for a long time. For the first time, Chu Fengmian's strength, transformation, Chu Fengmian's sword intent, and strength all poured into the two spiritual swords invisibly. The two spiritual swords had begun to transform into extreme immortal weapons, so they could withstand the bombardment of the spatial blades. The two spiritual swords could withstand it, but Chu Fengmian's body couldn't. His immortal crystals shattered one after another. Immortal, reconstruct. Enduring the bombardment of the spatial blades, Chu Fengmian roared again and again, pushing his power to the extreme. Countless immortal stones poured into the sky-devouring secret technique at this moment, turning into incomparably pure immortal energy that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The immortal crystals were reconstructed. Each time the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body was broken and reconstructed, the power they contained grew stronger. The primordial desolation White Wolf had put Chu Fengmian in an extremely dangerous situation, but it could be said that it had stimulated Chu Fengmian's potential. Only in a battle of life and death could a martial artist's true potential be stimulated. Any invincible expert must have defeated countless powerful enemies to have invincible strength. Only after experiencing numerous life and death battles could they transform. Now, as long as Chu Fengmian could escape from the hands of the ancient desolate White Wolf and successfully survive, this battle would be extremely beneficial to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian could also comprehend the power of the immortal monarch and improve his strength. Therefore, at this moment, Chu Fengmian went all out and unleashed all of his bloodline power. The ancestral sky dragon, the heaven-devouring beast, and the black whale, the bloodline power of the three innate divine beasts burst out from Chu Fengmian's body, turning into shadows. Boundless power poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The sword in his hand clashed repeatedly with the spatial blade. Eventually, the spatial blade's power was exhausted and it dissipated. However, even after blocking the spatial blade, Chu Fengmian didn't look relaxed at all. Instead, he looked extremely nervous. This move was just a casual attack for the ancient desolate White Wolf. For the wild beasts, their physical bodies were their most powerful means of attack. The spatial blade, condensed from the spatial Tao, was only 10% or 20% of the ancient desolate White Wolf's power. The ancient desolate White Wolf returned to the cave in an instant and blocked the entrance. He stared at Chu Fengmian with blood-red eyes. However, when the ancient desolate White Wolf saw the three figures behind Chu Fengmian, he was suddenly stunned. Although it was only for a moment, Chu Fengmian was sharp enough to capture it. Tianlong transformation. In an instant, the power of ancestor Tianlong erupted from Chu Fengmian's body, forcibly tearing the surrounding space apart and entering it in an instant. By the time the ancient desolate White Wolf reacted, Chu Fengmian's figure had already disappeared from the cave. At this time, Chu Fengmian no longer wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Although the unparalleled sword technique was good, it wasn't as important as his life. Chu Fengmian immediately exerted all his strength to activate the escape light and disappeared from the cave. Outside the valley, Chu Fengmian sat on the ground and gasped for breath. The fight with the ancient desolate White Wolf, this time, was extremely dangerous. Chu Fengmian almost died in the ancient desolate White Wolf's hands. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian had condensed the immortal real body, so his physical strength was much stronger than that of immortal generals and immortal marquises. Moreover, the immortal crystals could continuously reconstruct his body. Otherwise, Chu Fengmian would have been killed by the spatial blades just now. Moreover, he was able to escape now. Moreover, Chu Fengmian was able to escape this time because the ancient desolate White Wolf was stunned for a moment, which gave him the opportunity to escape. The ancient desolate White Wolf was stunned all of a sudden, as if it was intimidated by a force. Chu Fengmian was still thinking about the scene when he escaped. If it wasn't for the ancient desolate White Wolf being stunned, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to escape. Chu Fengmian didn't have the opportunity to escape from the ancient desolate White Wolf. Chu Fengmian was extremely lucky to be able to escape unscathed this time. Although many of his immortal crystals were shattered, Chu Fengmian still had a large number of immortal stones on him. Chu Fengmian always carried these immortal stones with him, waiting for such a dangerous moment to use the immortal power within them to reconstruct his immortal crystals. Compared to Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian, who had half of his body devoured, Chu Fengmian was already extremely lucky this time. At least he could escape unscathed. However, If the ancient, desolate white wolf hadn't suddenly stopped, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to escape unscathed. Chu Fengmian looked at the ancient, desolate white wolf's expression. He could tell that the ancient, desolate white wolf had sensed something on Chu Fengmian's body that it was extremely afraid of. That was why it was suddenly stunned. Could it be the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast? Chu Fengmian calmed down and almost immediately guessed the reason why the ancient, desolate white wolf was so wary. The bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast wasn't simply the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast in Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian's bloodline was also integrated into the heart of the heaven-devouring beast. The origin source of the heaven-devouring beast was flowing in Chu Fengmian's bloodline. The current Chu Fengmian could be considered as a half heaven-devouring beast. It wasn't as simple as the bloodline. End of chapter. Chapter 22:14. Although the ancient desolate white wolf was the overlord of the desolate beast race, it was still a desolate beast. The heaven-devouring beast was the ancestor of the desolate beasts. All the desolate beasts in the world had the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast. The ancient desolate white wolf was no exception. The noble suppression of the bloodline caused the ancient desolate white wolf to be extremely fearful. In the end, Chu Fengmian seized the opportunity to escape. With the heaven-devouring beast bloodline in Chu Fengmian's body, it was enough to suppress many desolate beasts. It was even possible for those desolate beasts to submit to Chu Fengmian. However, the heaven-devouring beast bloodline did not affect the ancient desolate white wolf that much. The ancient desolate white wolf was one of the strongest existences in the desolate beast race. The suppression of the bloodline was also much smaller. Moreover, the strength of the ancient desolate white wolf had surpassed an ordinary ancient desolate white wolf. It had reached the immortal Lord realm, and its strength was far beyond the ancient desolate white wolf. Therefore, the ancient desolate white wolf could only suppress Chu Fengmian for a moment when it felt the power of the heaven-devouring beast bloodline. As for the next moment, if Chu Fengmian did not escape, he would have been buried in the wolf's stomach. If Chu Fengmian wanted to use the heaven-devouring beast bloodline to subdue or suppress the ancient desolate white wolf, it was simply impossible. The unparalleled sword principle is actually guarded by an ancient desolate white wolf. The sword sect assessment is actually so crazy, it should be impossible to pass. Chu Fengmian could only be described as crazy towards the sword sex assessment. An immortal lord ancient desolate white wolf was guarding the unparalleled sword principle. To defeat the ancient desolate white wolf, even if Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Flying Sword Emperor, and dozens of helpers worked together, they would not be able to defeat the ancient desolate white wolf, let alone Chu Fengmian. To the ancient desolate white wolf, Chu Fengmian's strength was only considered as an ant. At most, he would be an annoying ant. There was still a chance for him to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. However, it was impossible for Chu Fengmian and the others to fight the ancient desolate white wolf head-on. Even 100 Chu Fengmians would not be able to fight the ancient desolate white wolf. This test was almost impossible. It was easy to find the unparalleled sword technique, but it was almost impossible to take it away from the hands of the ancient desolate white wolf. Even Chu Fengmian was somewhat helpless. Xingxuan, do you have any ideas? Helpless, Chu Fengmian could only ask Xing Xian. Xing Xian's understanding of the sword sect far surpassed Chu Fengmian's. Perhaps he had some ideas. There's no other way. Unless you use my real body, you won't be able to fight against the ancient desolate white wolf head-on. However, you haven't passed the test. If you want to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword, you'll only end up dead. Xing Xian's voice resounded. The last time you used the bloodlust demon sword, I suppressed the majority of its killing intent, so you didn't die. This time, if you use it again, even if you don't die, you will become a monster that only knows how to kill. After Xing Xian finished speaking, his voice disappeared. Hearing this, Chu Fengmian felt somewhat helpless. Previously, when facing the ancient desolate white wolf and escaping from it, Chu Fengmian had almost used all his trump cards. If he wanted to fight the ancient desolate white wolf head-on, his only chance was to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword. When Chu Fengmian attacked the Six Paths Demon Gates and faced celestial demon supremacy, he had used the blood-slaughtering demon sword to kill celestial demon supremacy. Although he had only used the power of the bloodlust demon sword once, Chu Fengmian knew that the power of the bloodlust demon sword was much stronger than many extreme Dao celestial weapons. If he used the blood-slaughtering demon sword, he might be able to fight the ancient desolate white wolf. Therefore, Chu Fengmian wanted to ask Xing Xian. However, after hearing Xing Xian's words, Chu Fengmian didn't dare to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword rashly. He didn't dare to disobey Xing Xian's warning. He didn't want to become a sword demon, a monster that only knew how to kill. Every time the blood-slaughtering demon sword appeared in the 9 regions, it would cause a storm of blood. Its former master would become a monster that only knew how to kill. Chu Fengmian didn't want to follow in their footsteps. However, if he didn't use the blood-slaughtering demon sword, Chu Fengmian wouldn't be able to defeat the ancient desolate white wolf. There must be a way to pass the test, since it's called a test. Otherwise, Jian and I wouldn't have set such an impossible test. The purpose of the upper sword sex appearance and the upper sword execution token was to select a successor to inherit the upper sword sex sword skills. This stage was the last one. Although it seemed as difficult as ascending to the heavens, there must be a way to pass it. Otherwise, Jian and I wouldn't have spent so much effort to set up this test. Since it was a test, there must be a way to pass it. Let's go and take a look. After Chu Fengmian recovered from his injuries, he gradually approached the valley. This time, he took the risk to follow Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor into the valley. At least, Chu Fengmian was sure that the unparalleled sword art was in the cave deep in the valley. Moreover, there was an immortal monarch realm, ancient desolate white wolf guarding it. Knowing this, Chu Fengmian could come up with a plan. There was no need for him to enter the valley rashly. Chu Fengmian carefully approached the valley and looked at the valley. Now that he knew that there was an ancient desolate white wolf hidden in the valley, he naturally had to be extra careful. Otherwise, if the ancient desolate white wolf chased after him, it wouldn't be easy for Chu Fengmian to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. Chu Fengmian's luck wouldn't be so good every time. As Chu Fengmian approached the valley, there were 2 other figures carefully standing at the edge of the valley and looking at the valley. They were Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Humph! When the 2 of them saw Chu Fengmian's arrival, their eyes revealed a bit of coldness. They had already guessed that Chu Fengmian had hidden himself and followed the 2 of them into the valley when Chu Fengmian rushed into the cave. Now, the 2 of them looked at Chu Fengmian with murderous intent. They couldn't wait to kill Chu Fengmian. Looking at the murderous intent in the eyes of Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, Chu Fengmian's face was indifferent. Since they had already shed all pretense of cordiality, Chu Fengmian didn't care anymore. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the unparalleled sword art and the upper sword sex inheritance, the first thing he would do was to kill the 2 of them. In a chapter that you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.